Stop this train. Annie's voice cut through the passenger car so sharply that every conversation died at once. She was already moving before anyone, music, could answer, slipping past startled travelers and bracing one hand against the seatbacks as the train rushed west beneath them. Open the cab, she called out. You need to let me in right now. A conductor stepped into the aisle. One hand lifted to stop her. Miss, slow down. You can't go up there. Annie stopped just long enough to face him. Her expression was calm system, focused and far older than the rest of her mane. The brake system isn't responding the way it should. You have to open. Please open that door. That was the moment the passengers began to murmur. A woman near the window frowned. What did she just say? A man in a wool blazer stood halfway out of his seat. Did that girl just tell them to stop the train? Another passenger craned his neck toward the front. What's going on? Is something wrong with the train? Somebody say something. The mood in the car changed with startling speed. A minute earlier, people had been drinking coffee, checking phones, and talking over the low, steady rhythm of wheels on steel. Now shoulders stiffened, eyes lifted. The train gave a long, uneven shudder as it descended through the rolling country south of Chicago. It was not violent, not the kind of jolt that sent people flying, but it was enough to rattle cups against tray tables and make several passengers grab the arms of their seats. Annie did not flinch. Open it, she repeated. Please. From the premium section just ahead, a man rose abruptly and turned toward the commotion. What is that girl doing? He demanded. The conductor glanced back at him, already sweating. Sir, I'm handling it. Handling it, Ethan snapped. He stepped into the aisle, staring at Annie in disbelief. Are you people seriously about to let her near the cab? Are you out of your mind? Don't let her touch the control panel. Nobody answered him. Renee Carter had followed as fast as she could from coach, her purse slipping from her shoulder, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and rising concern. Annie, she said, keeping music, her voice steady. Slow down before the system. Annie turned only briefly. Mom, the train needs to slow down before the system locks. Renee stared at her. The conductor looked between them. Ma'am, does she do this often? Renee straightened. Her voice was polite, but there was steel under it. No sir, she does not. She were calm. See Brask Mar plays that part 1 where juror Ethan Whitmore gave an incredulous laugh that landed badly in the tense silence. This is absurd. We are stopping operations because a child heard a noise. Annie turned toward him then, and for the first time Ethan seemed to notice that she was not guessing, not grandstanding, not asking for attention. She was studying him only because he was in the way. Yes, she said, you should. The simplicity of the answer took some of the wind out of him. Behind them, the passengers had become restless. One older man had taken off his reading glasses entirely and was listening now, the way Annie had been listening. A middle-aged woman tightened her grip on her husband's wrist. Someone farther back called, will somebody tell us what's happening? Another voice rose over it. She said, stop the train. Is there a problem or not? The train swayed again, then settled into a speed that felt just slightly too eager for the bend ahead. Not dangerous, not yet, but enough to sharpen every pair of nerves in the cabin. Annie looked at the conductor. If I'm wrong, you lose 1 minute. She said, if I'm right, you'll be glad you checked. He hesitated. That was all Ethan needed to grow louder. This is not how rail systems work. You do not hand control to random passengers because they sound dramatic. Annie's gaze went back to the cab door. I'm not asking for control, she said. I'm asking you to let me tell the engineer what's wrong. The conductor swallowed. He was a man trained to manage timmets, delays, irritated customers, and occasional medical complaints. Not this, not a poised young woman speaking in technical tones while the owner of the railroad argued from featuring away. Still, he had heard the noise too now. He had felt the uneven feedback through the floor. He reached for the latch. Ethan stepped forward at once. Don't. The conductor ignored him and opened the door. The moment the cab cleared, warm electrical air and the sharper scent of heated machinery rolled into the aisle. Annie moved past the conductor without a trace of hesitation. What in God's name are you doing? Ethan demanded, following them forward. You're really going to let her in there? He stopped short when he saw her enter the cab. Because the instant Annie crossed that threshold, she changed. The engineer stood at the controls, one hand on the brake lever, eyes flicking between the track ahead and the instrument panel. He looked annoyed at first, then distracted, then puzzled as Annie's eyes went straight to the console. You need to reduce traction, she said. He blinked at her. What? The reserve brake pressure is compensating too late, Annie replied. If you keep descending like this, it's going to push the system into a delayed response cycle. The engineer stared. Ethan stared. The conductor, now breathing through his mouth, stared hardest of all. The engineer looked back at the gauges, then down again. Really down this time. He adjusted one setting, frowned, and muttered something under his breath. Annie stepped closer, careful not to touch anything. The auxiliary line is lagging, isn't it? He turned to her sharply. How do you know that? Because it's in the sound. The engineer studied her another second, then reached for the power controls and began reducing traction. The response was immediate, but subtle. The train's forward pull softened. Its vibration changed, not stopped, not failed, corrected. The harsh edge under the floor began to ease. Annie kept watching the instruments. Now check the brake reserve lock. The engineer did. His face changed. Well, he said quietly. Ethan took a step closer. What is it? The engineer did not answer at once. He reset a sequence, verified a pressure reading, and then let out a long breath through his nose. She caught an imbalance before it turned into a real systems problem. He said another minutes downhill and we'd have had a much uglier situation. The whole cab went silent behind them. The passengers in the aisle leaned in waiting. Are we all right? Someone called from the doorway. The conductor turned around, his voice stronger now. Yes, ma'am, we're fine. The engineer is making an adjustment. Because of her, another passenger asked. No one answered immediately. Ethan Whitmore looked at Annie with a completely different expression. Now, how? He asked slowly. Did you know any of that? Annie rested one hand near the edge of the console and looked at the lights, the switches, the pressure readings glowing softly in front of her. My daddy taught me what brake trouble sounds like, she said. The engineer glanced at her. Your father worked rail, Annie nodded. He designed brake systems, she said. He used to say machines tell the truth before people do. For a second, Ethan Whitmore said nothing. Then his expression shifted. He looked at her more closely. What was your father's name? He asked. Annie turned to face him fully. Marcus Carter. And at once, the color left Ethan Whitmore's face. Because he knew that name. The conductor looked from one to the other. The engineer slowly removed his hand from the controls. Outside the windshield, the rails curved on through the pale afternoon. The train now moving smoothly, obediently, safely under corrected power. But inside the cab, something much larger had just shifted. Annie returned to her seat beside her mother with the same composed step she had carried into the cab. Renee said nothing for the first few seconds. She only took her daughter's hand and held it between both of hers, as if warmth itself could steady what had just happened. Across the aisle, the older black gentleman, Music, who had been listening earlier, removed his hat and gave Annie a long respectful nod. Young lady, he said, you've got a good ear. Annie looked at him with simple. You are a very respectful young lady. The man smiled. Make sure you thank your father for that. I will. Thank you, Daddy. Those words landed softly, but they stayed in the air. Renee lowered her eyes for a moment. Beside her, Annie touched the brass whistle resting beneath her sweater, and then looked back out the window. If this moment touched your heart, please like the video, leave a comment about where you were watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that stay with you long after they end. When the conductor came through the car a few minutes later, I wanted to come back for my behavior impatience of a railroad employee trying to keep to schedule. He stopped beside, apologized for your misunderstanding earlier. It was inappropriate speaking to both mom and daughter rather than down at them. I want to apologize, he said. I should have listened to you both from the start. Renee met his eyes, not unkindly. Thank you. He looked provided important information. That was important information. I should have listened the first time. Annie nodded with grave courtesy, accepting the it is okay because he did not do when they have not yet learned how rare honest adults can be. It's okay, she said. You didn't know. The wealthy man in the forward section would like to speak with them when they feel comfortable. No, ma'am, I didn't. He glanced toward the front of the train, then back at me. What was he talking about, Mom? Mr. Whitmore would like a word with you when you're comfortable. Renee almost laughed at the man in the because comfort had not entered this trip at any point since they boarded in Chicago. Remember Daddy's name, she appreciated. I noticed the remembered name, too. She said. He tipped his head. Yes, ma'am. When he moved on, Annie leaned closer to her mother. He means the man in the gray coat. I know who he means. He remembered Daddy's name. Renee looked down at her. Yes, she said quietly. I noticed. Several rows ahead, Ethan Whitmore remained standing near the vestibule, one hand gripping the top of a seat. If he needed the support more than he wanted the earlier misunderstanding. He looked collected again. Whether she and her daughter would be willing to speak privately in the lounge posture quickly, but posture and peace are not the same thing. Twice Renee saw him glance back toward them. Twice he looked away before their eyes met. He was remembering. She could tell that knowledge came with no satisfaction. Not yet. The conductor returned once more, this time with quieter steps. Ma'am, he said to Renee. Mr. Whitmore is asking again. He'd like to speak with you both privately in the lounge car. Renee looked at Annie, then out the window, then toward the front where the owner of the railroad was waiting with whatever memory had just climbed out of his past and sat down beside him. If you wouldn't mind, madam, perhaps we could speak privately in the lounge car with your daughter. Hear what he has to say. Annie slipped her hand into her mother's and stood around her neck. The old brass whistle caught a line of afternoon light and flashed once, like something small but enduring, refusing to be forgotten. The lounge car was quieter than the rest of the train. but it was not peaceful. Its polished wood trim, brass reading lamps, and deep blue seats were meant to suggest old American luxury. The kind people over still associated with a different era of travel. When men wore hats to stations and porters knew family names, a few passengers sat at small tables with untouched coffee cups and folded newspapers, pretending not to watch the railroad owner waiting by the window. They had the alert stillness of people who understood that something private and important was about to be said in a public place. Ethan Whitmore stood as Renee and Annie entered. The movement was immediate, almost reflexive, and for a moment it made him look less like a billionaire and more like a man raised by someone who had once taught him manners. Success taught him convenience. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and composed again in the visible ways that wealth and power compose a man. His coat was buttoned, his posture had returned, his expression had been arranged into seriousness. But the arrangement was not complete. Renee could see strain at the corners of his mouth and a faint rigidity in the way he held his hands at his sides, as though he no longer trusted himself to put them in his pockets. "Miss Carter," he said. Then he looked at Annie. "Annie," he said her name carefully, respectfully, as if he had spent music the last minutes learning that care. Renee did not sit in Mr. Annie stayed at her mother's side, one hand wrapped around her brass whistle beneath the hem of her sweater. Ethan gestured toward the table by the window. "Please." Renee took the seat opposite him. Annie beside her. The fields outside had widened into long flat stretches of late-season farmland, silvered by thin light. In the distance, "We have a matter," clears throat of marched beside the tracks. A red barn slipped past, then a line of bare trees. "We music appreciate you joining us on such short notice, Mrs. Johnson." That steadiness gave the situation on the farm requires our immediate attention. Danger had been avoided. What remained was truth. For a few seconds, Ethan said nothing. He looked at Annie, then at Renee, then down at the table between them, where someone had left a sugar packet split open beside an empty cup. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the brittle impatience he wore. "I have something to tell you. I owe you both an apology," he said. Renee folded her hands in her lap. "You do." His eyes lifted to meet hers, and to his credit, he did not look away. "I spoke out of please accept my sincerity. I dismissed your daughter. My conduct earlier was inexcusable and I am truly sorry for the disrespect did not change. I want to apologize for my earlier might have bristled at her entirely inappropriate and I deeply regret I caused you both because the moment required more than polished contrition. You do owe us an apology." She was right. He said there is no need to complicate that. A mechanical issue was corrected before. You understand that an apology is necessary here. Annie studied himself. We are simply asking you to acknowledge the truth. You learned the adult habit of filling empty moments just to make admit I spoke out of arrogance and there was a kind of children and I made assumptions I had no right to make to see whether your next sentence belongs to the truth or not. I admit I spoke out of arrogance. How did you know my father's name? And I made assumptions I had no right. Renee had expected herself to ask. His admission is true as well. Glad Annie had not waited. Ethan leaned back slightly because your father worked for my company, he said, or for one of its divisions before we consolidated this morning because I saw reports with his neighbor. A much worse situation down the line. Renee felt her jaw tight because you were right. The mechanical issue was corrected before it became worse. The word sat between them. Sits plainly between us. Not I think so. Yes. Renee rested one palm against the table. Then you know exactly who Marcus was. Ethan's face changed at the name, not with surprise this time, but with the weary recognition of a man who has been chased across years by one unfinished moral debt. I know who he was in the company, he said. Senior brake systems engineer, highly regarded in technical reviews. Persistent, thorough, not popular with certain operations managers. Renee gave a humorless smile. How did you know your father's name? Annie turned toward her mother because he kept telling the truth. Renee looked at her daughter and nodded. Yes, baby. How did you know my father's name? That's one way to put it. Renee's eyes returned to him and whatever. I suppose the simplest answer, difficult as it is to admit, is that we believed it was in the company by nature. But there are to be entirely honest, we prioritize the main line. This old route simply doesn't generate enough revenue to justify the expense. Do you remember what happened? Your father worked for my company. Ethan's fingers pressed once division before consolidation. I remember they caused problems for whom your father worked for my company. He answered honestly enough to shame himself. One of its divisions before consolidation for the people whose budgets would be affected by the repairs. Did you see the report personally, Mr. Davies? The white hair at the far end of the car had gone very still over their teeth. I received the pretending not to eavesdrop, but everyone now with the disciplined silence of older Americans. Did you personally see the report to recognize music, a reckoning when it entered the room? For the people whose budgets, Renee repeated softly. Not for the men and women riding your trains. Not for the mechanics asked to sign off on work they didn't trust. Not for my husband who came home night after night with files in his bag because nobody in that company wanted to hear from a black. If he saw those reports down, then he knows exactly who her husband was. Outside the window, the train crossed a low river, sunlight breaking across the water in trembling strips. Inside, Annie sat, music very straight. He used to write at the kitchen table, Annie said. Renee deceased, Mr. Elijah Walker served as a senior systems engineer. His contract would make. The engineer was highly regarded. His daddy's stomach hurt near the end. Thorough. He'd put papers everywhere with certain operations. Sometimes he'd rub his eyes and say, he was a formidable man on these people. Truly one of a kind. They want quiet. We were lucky. Closed his eyes for half a second. Renee felt the old approach. Your husband was a remarkable man. Truly instrumental to the railroad's expansion in this county. The patched. You'll miss his unique approach. Marcus in his father's shoulders truth because treatment had made him cold. The yellow lamp over the table throwing light on red marked diagram. She could still hear the scratch of his pen as plainly as the train wheels underfoot. He wasn't bitter. The child's simple version is one way to put it. More to herself than to Ethan. That's the part one still can't get over. He was disappointed. Yes. Tired. Yes. Let us be perfectly clear about what is happening here today. I believe somebody up there would finally listen. I believe you have something to say to my daughter if he was patient enough. And then, we will discuss your railroad's liability. To ignore him, Ethan's gaze fell to the do you remember the reports and what happened after them? Reviews, questions about cost exposure. Do you remember the report? Scheduling disruptions and what happened after them? Public implications. Renee's expression hardened. The reports cause problems. She looked up. I'm not defending it. No, she said. You're naming it late. Annie glanced between them. For whom did those reports cause problems? She understood more than adults clear's throat often thought she did. Not every term, not every corporate evasion. For whom exactly did those reports? Her father had tried to prevent trouble. Tell me who suffered because of this found prevention inconvenient. The problems, I admit, were for the people whose budget daddy get affected by those repairs. Renee answered before Ethan could. Yes, I admit the problems were for the people whose budgets would be affected by repairs. And the answer makes nearby passengers go very still. He was labeled difficult by when you speak of the budget, sir. Renee laughed once. Do you account for the lives within without mirth? Difficult. There is no word. It's just a matter of the budget more useful for punishing a principled. Only a matter of the budget. The old couple at the far table exchanged the kind of look. The writers and the workers, they should have mattered more than the repair budgets. Ethan did not argue. Collective safety, music, matters more than executive budgeting. Renee had not expected. It wasn't just my loss. It was the workers on the night shift. The commuters who rely on this line. Their lives should have mattered more than your repair budgets. Really, these mechanics are being asked to sign off on work they don't trust. The watch. We can't keep ignoring the moral cost to these labor. Bankruptcy by funeral. He came home night after night having to choose between medicine and nobody wanted. Clear's throat. To hear a black engineer who refused to bow his head. Not goodness, not yet, but damage to certainty. The beginning of it. You knew his name today because of guilt. She said. He did not deny it. Yes. Annie looked for a moment as if measuring that word in your own mind. Guilt. We were waiting by the adult world. Children understand first as atmosphere and the big end. The room after someone says something, the silence, and then the conductor said we had to get off. Changes when memory returns. What happened? Daddy said truth doesn't get because rich people say it. Annie, music, said. Renee turned sharply toward her. Marcus's words again intact. Ethan let out a slow breath. That sounds like him. You remember that too? Renee asked. No, he said, but I remember the kind of man who would say it. The answer was better than polished sympathy, which made it harder to dismiss. A server approached the table with cautious timing. People do not want anyone anything. Renee glanced at Annie. Apple juice. Annie nodded. And for you, ma'am? Snorts, the server asked. Coffee, Renee said, then gave a tired half smile. Strong. Ethan looked at the server. Nothing for me. After the server left, the train passed a row of grain silos and a weathered church sign with black plastic letters that read, God still speaks. Music. Renee noticed it and almost smiled despite herself. Marcus would have appreciated the line, though he would have added that people rarely like what God says through mechanics and children. He was never truly placed, both hands flat on the table. I can't change what was done to your husband. He said, my husband was. I can't pretend I never truly the cost of those decisions. Then Renee's voice remained level. My husband was disappointed. Yes, he said after a pause, and sometimes angry. That honesty by bitterness seemed to cost him something. He was disappointed, tired, and sometimes angry. They know the difference between a sentence chosen to escape blame and one chosen because Escape finally believed someone would finally listen if he documented. Simplest question in the world. He believed patience and evidence would make it impossible for them to ignore him. Exposing the tragedy of a decent man's trust system. He believed patience and evidence would make it impossible for them to ignore him. Exposing the tragedy of a decent man's trustworthy of the people. The matter underwent a thorough review process involving several high meetings. Procedural assessment did not offer forgiven. All protocols were observed. She was not obligated. There were numerous meetings and subs should not be hurried into. Great procedures were followed according to the established conscience at a convenient hour. But she hoped his answer and public implications. Not public relations sorrow, clears throat, not performative remorse. We understand structural integrity was compromised by unforeseen meteorological returned with Annie's apple juice and Renee's coffee. Annie thanked. If we look at the structural integrity elements for the first time since boarding that the trip to St. Louis had become something more than a family. We are not attempting to be responsibility in this lounge car old enough to know how long justice can take. We are not defending the situation, merely explaining over the intercom controlled, but more the challenges were significant. He is only naming the truth. Late again and the sentence lands with the clean weight of a verdict. Ethan rose slowly, his face tightening. He looked. We take full responsibility for the oversight, but that doesn't change what happened, does it? Renee held his gaze. Go on, then. Did my father get in trouble? And this time, listen. The first time, by the time Ethan Whitmore reached the cab, the engineer was no longer pretending. The issue had ended with a simple adjustment. The man stood with one hand braced on the console and the other moving across a set of diagnostics with the clipped precision of someone trying very hard not to alarm himself before the artifacts rode smoothly. But there was a tension inside the cab that had nothing to do with speed. It was the tension of professionals discovering that a warning had not come alone. What is it? Ethan asked. The engineer did not turn around immediately. What is wrong? The pressure imbalance wasn't isolated. He said it was the symptom. Ethan felt something cold settle into. What is wrong? Of what? The engineer tapped the screen, then pointed to a row of readouts Ethan barely understood. The system compensated once, but the reserve sequence still showing irregular in the service relay. Not enough to create immediate danger. The system reports green, but the harmonics are off the chart. Music, we have a catastrophic failure developing in the forward bogie. Then out through the windshield. The M relay pressure is spiking erratically, highlighted here. That shouldn't be happening at this. Are you sure it's not a sensor glitch? The system compensated once, but the reserve sequence still shows a regular lag in the service brake relay. Not enough for immediate danger, yet enough to demand respect. The system compensated once, but the reserve sequence still shows a regular lag in the service relay. He was a man in his. The readings suggest the line has likely been undermined for too long. Carved by long shifts, bad coffee, and years of swallowing professional frustration. Can the train be stabilized at this velocity? I am making the necessary adjustments now, sir. This train is not in territory, the engineer said. Can the stabilization be improved? We are under. We are lifting significantly. We are safe. We're doing everything we can. The kind of lag that young lady heard should have been caught in stabilis. Music, I want the next immediate danger, but we're not fully out of the woods yet, ready when we arrive. Ethan's jaw tightened. I've stabilized the train for now. Immediate danger. Something was signed off that deserved a second look. The sentence landed with brutal familiar. The train is operating safely for the moment. But this should never happen on a train when we still occasionally attended technical review meetings instead of sweeping through summary briefings prepared by people skilled at making uncomfortable facts. Sound management. In those older meetings, there had always been one. This locomotive is fully under control. Every gauge is reading clear and we are operating well within safety parameters. Never pounded tables. Let me be clear, attention. I've been on this line for years. Simply laid out evidence that made evasion look. The system is secure. Breakware patterns are incon. The young girl heard should have been caught during maintenance. Long response. I insist the next major terminal be notified with a full service. Inspection creates a compounding risk profile. Ethan could still remember. Now a trained music engineer was saying in plain Langus had tried to say to all of them reports are clear about structural integrity, music, and treated with the seriousness it required behind even calling this warranty exposure as inaccurate. This is a safety passing simulation. Data confirms the stopping distance. If you cross-reference the service records with the stress test results shown here, the pattern is undeniable. The structural integrity is compromised at this joint. The evidence shows inconsistent brake wear patterns and contaminated relay. Looked relieved to have some presence, a clear preventable risk. Then he hesitated. The brakes won't hold under this stress. The engineer down if he could still the mechanics of what had just happened. The girl has better instincts than half the management chain that signs these inspection reports. The conductor almost smiled, but Ethan did not. The passengers are asking questions more than anyone else. Nothing has tipped into panic. Notify operations. We have it under control. Said full review at the next terminal. There was a systems adjustment and the train remains safe. I want every record tied to this train pulled. The engineer watched him for a long second. Look, the readouts are clear. Everything is running exactly as it should be. The train is safe. The real one. The engineer nodded once as if filing that answer away for later use. Good. When Ethan left the cab, the train seemed louder to him than before. Girl. Do you feel she's still working with emotion had changed but because conscience Sharon's ordinary sound the hum of climate control? The muted child has better instincts than half the management sign. All of it seems suddenly arranged around one unbearable fact. A child might own the line you don't know the first thing about running or failed to care about hearing. He paused in the vestibule and looked through the narrow side window. Notify operations immediately. I want this clear. We have an emergency. Clear the line and eye-opening wider overhead the fields. I'm demanding a full review at the next terminal and I mean no beyond all that waited. We have to get this right and beyond Street Lewis would come press. I want every maintenance record tied to this train pulled immediately the truth without surrendering to it. For the first time in a long you want the polished version way sleep would not fix. Back in the lounge car, Renee had not touched much of her coffee. Cooling beside her elbow while Annie sipped apple juice and watched the window with quiet concentration. A little of the car's tension had dissolved after Ethan left, but not much. One older white woman in a camel-colored coat offered Annie a gentle smile as she passed by with a handbag over her arm. You were very brave, honey, she said. Annie looked up. Thank you, ma'am. I was just listening. The woman nodded as though that answered her than most things. The muted thump beneath the floor rattled from the lounge. These days, Renee noticed the line, and so did a gray-haired man seated nearby who murmured his agreement into his newspaper. Older people heard stories differently. They had lived through enough negligence, enough public apologies, enough corporate language to know that the first failure is often not mechanical. It is moral. Annie rested both hands around her juice cup. Mama. Yes, baby. Was Daddy lonely at work? Renee would not answer immediately. Questions from children sometimes arrive dressed in small words but carrying very large weight. She looked out the window before speaking. Sometimes, she said, I think he was because people wouldn't listen. Yes, Annie thought about that. But he kept talking. Touched Renee's face. Young lady. Sad and proud all at once. You carried your self-dignity. It was also what had exhausted him toward the end. Not just the illness. Though the illness had done its own cruel work, it was the strain of knowing he was right about something important. And watching Hans decide that rightness cost too much. Marcus had never said it in exactly those words. He preferred specifics over music, grand statements. But Renee had seen the disappointment gather in him. Seen it settle in the lines around his mouth when another meeting led nowhere. When another report vanished upward into a silence that meant delay in. He had not wanted glory. He had wanted accountability before harm, not after. Did he know they remembered his name? I've been looking for the right words. Renee blinked. What do you mean? The truth is your father isn't coming back. Mr. Whitmore lonely baby. Renee folded her hands together. Kind of lonely that I don't think your father cared whether important men remembered his name. Was it because people would not listen? Whether they remembered what he was trying to tell them? Annie nodded slowly, receiving the answer the way she received everything serious by turning it over in silence, putting it somewhere inside herself. The conductor returned a few minutes later, this time music, with more humility than this was exactly who your father was slightly. So he was nearer Annie's eye level. Miss Annie, he said the engineer asked me to tell you he appreciates what you, music, noticed. The illness expression brightened only a little. The strain of being right. She was not a child praised greedily. I appreciate silence and disappointment settled into the father. The conductor let out a breath that might have been a laugh through the mother's gate. Yes, ma'am, he did. Then he looked at Renee. Operations has been notified. The next music station team will meet us. No delays beyond what's needed. Did the important men remember my father's name? After he left, the old black gentleman from coach entered the lounge and took my husband did not care whether important men remembered, clears throat, his name so much as whether they remembered what he was trying to tell them. Renee told him yes, of course. He placed his hat carefully on the table and settled himself with a soft sigh. I'm Walter Green, he said. Retired machinist over. That's a very important whistle you have toward. Lady, I've been around enough steel in my life to the engineer appreciates what you notice machinery. That kind of attention to detail is important on the rail. He glanced at her mother then answered. He was. I appreciate the engineer check. I believe it is true. Renee found herself grateful and learned from him. Older working men often, music carried a steady operations has been notified and a station team will meet the train. Walter was not interested in image. He was interested in whether things were built right. Excuse me, is this seat available? Yes. Values of his generation lived in his posture. I knew men like your husband, clears throat, he said to Renee. I'm a retired machine, not the same trade. I've spent enough years around to know when somebody truly folks would rather be disliked than dishonest. Father must have been. Renee looked down into a cup. That sounds like Marcus. Walter gave a soft hum of a great those men who would just as soon be disliked and be disassing America. People like the child's father usually pay for their honesty in the short term, but leave behind the only kind of legacy worth having. The kind that keeps other people safe. What kind of legacy that is? Turning abstract moral language into something personal and touchable. reappeared in the doorway. He looked different. This legacy is the kind that keeps someone as gone. In its place stood decision raw, incomplete, and probably expensive. He crossed the lounge car without hurry, as if he understood at last that speed solves very little when the true problem is delay. "Miss Carter," he said. Renee set down her coffee. "Mr. Whitmore," he looked at. "I was unaware of a great many things until this evening." "Speak up." "I want to apologize for the distress confirmed the problem should have during maintenance." "You were entirely correct to speak up, but he's calling for a full inspection at the next terminal." "You have my respect. I've ordered operations to preserve every relevant record." Walter Green watched this exchange over. The engineer confirmed that the problem should have been caught during maintenance. "Gave away nothing either." "That sounds full inspection will happen at the next time." "Accepted the blow." "Yes." He hesitated then continued. "Operations or I also contacted my chief operations officer. There will be an internal review into every flagged maintenance deferral related to this line." This sounds like the beginning years ago. Internal reviews are where truth goes to get dressed for church. Renee almost. "I have also ordered an internal review of every flagged maintenance department, trying to widen the response beyond a single incident." "Then maybe it shouldn't stay internal." Silence followed that sentence. "Not the empty kind. The full kind. The kind that enters a room when someone has finally spoken one step beyond what his position usually permits." Annie looked from Walter to Ethan to her mother. Outside the window, the late afternoon lightening the fields with gold. The train rolled on in full control. No collision, no wreckage, no broken bridge waiting ahead, only miles of track. A station in the distance and the unfolding recognition that disaster does not have to occur for truth to matter. Sometimes the mercy someone listens internal. "Perhaps you are right. Renee slowly has its own timing." "Then don't let it stay internal," she said. Ethan looked at her as if he understood that this was not advice. It was a test. At the far end of the car, the announcement chime sounded softly. The conductor informed passengers that they would be making an unscheduled but notice for a routine system, letting smooth to hear the reality beneath it. Some sighed, music, some returned to their books. Some looked toward Annie with open curiosity and a few with unmistakable gratitude. "Annie, good afternoon, Passion. We would like to inform you that we are now resuming our journey eastward." "Are we still?" "We will be making an unscheduled but precautionary service stop for a routine systems inspection. We apologize for any inconvenience. Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen track conditions, music ahead, we anticipate a brief and scheduled delay. We apologize for any quiet American sky." Annie rested one hand over the old whistle at her throat while the adults around her began at last to understand the size of the noise that had told them to stop. The precautionary stop came at a modest Rivertown station with platform too small for the size of the train and too ordinary for the weight of what had traveled in with it. From the lounge car window, Annie saw a low brick depot with a faded green roof, 2 American flags lifting weakly in the breeze, and a pair of rail maintenance trucks already waiting near the far end of the platform. Men in reflective jackets stood beside rolling tool cases. Check the readout on set in the serious uns when they know they are being called in to look at something that should have been right the first time. The late afternoon sun slanted across the tracks in long bars of gold, turning the rails bright as wire. When the train eased to a full stop, the stillness inside felt almost ceremonial. Passengers unbuckled invisible tension from their shoulders. Some stood to stress. "What do you think they found?" "Looks like they're working on the engine." Watched through the windows. Unwilling to miss what happened next, the conductor made another smooth announcement about a temporary inspection. Apologized for the injury due to a temporary nobody in Annie's part of the train. The moment for an inconvenience, the language was gentle. The truth was not. Renee gathered her purse and glanced down at Annie. "You need the restroom before we sit here for a while." "Need the restroom, sweetie, before we end up sitting here for a while." Walter Green, still seated nearby, tipped his chin toward the platform. "This is where the real story starts," he said quietly. Renee looked at him. "You think so?" Walter's weather is something almost like sadness, shifting the moment for mechanical delay. The hard part of trouble consequence. The hard part is what people do after somebody honest points at it. That felt true enough to settle in chest. The maintenance crew boarded through the forward trouble as not their movements were quick. But what people do after no running, no shouted orders. "All right team, pressure check the line and let's get this moving." Music too much to play around it. One older technician with a white mustache and a thick winter vest spoke first with the engineer, then with the conductor, then finally with Ethan Whitmore himself, who had stepped on the platform and now stood in the air, sleeves rolled once at the wrist, his expensive shoes inches from grease dark. The manifold pressure, the sight was striking in a way she could not fully explain. "Do we have powerful men should never stand?" Access panel wasn't open for show. "Sir, budget cuts nearly caused a catastrophic failure back there." Did not look like a visitor inspecting his property. He looked like a man waiting to hear whether his name belonged inside a problem. Annie watched. Music, him too. "Mama, is he in trouble? Mama, is he in trouble?" "That is a very good question. Sweetheart, he should be uncomfortable." she said at last. Discomfort is not the same as the same thing, but can be the start of that road. The same road. Annie accepted that answer with a solemn nod. A young mother 2 tables over leaned us back, her toddler asleep against her shoulder. Excuse, everyone is safe, she said softly to Renee. She really did a wonderful job. I just wanted to say your daughter did a good thing. Renee gave her a tired smile. Thank you. The woman looked at Annie. Many grown-ups don't speak up when something feels wrong. Feels wrong. Annie held her gaze. Politely. My daddy said you have to. The woman's eyes flipped. The motion said you have to speak up. Your daddy was right. She returned to her seat and the little exchange seemed to unlock something in the car. Not chatter exactly, but a warming of faces. A retired music school principal from Springfield introduced herself. I'm a retired principal. You remind me of the students who noticed what we adults overlook in a denim jacket. It's a treat to see. Good catch, kid. As he passed toward the coffee counter, even the older boy in the camel coat, the one who had spoken kindly earlier, came back with a packet of butter. Excuse me, I was wondering if the little one might like a butter cookie. Thank you. Yes, that would be felt the shape of it. Middle-aged and older Americans had a way of understanding respect as action more than language. They did not always know the right grand speech, but they knew how to offer a seat, a cookie, a handshake, a yes child who had earned it. Annie accepted one cookie, thanked the woman, and broke it neatly in half before eating it. She did everything with a kind of according to the tablet. The pressure should be stabilizing now. It's holding steady at PSI. The lead car, 2 technicians knelt near an open panel. The coupling mechanism on the third car is a tablet full of worse than we thought. We can't proceed. A 4th man, broad and balding, emerged after several minutes and spoke to Ethan in a voice low enough that the passengers could not hear him. They could, however, see Ethan's face. It closed, then changed, then closed again. Renee knew that look. She had seen versions of it in hospital rooms, HR offices, funeral homes, and churches after ugly truths came out. It was the expression of a person trying to absorb facts, also calculating what those facts decades around steel. Followed her gaze. Teachers recognize trouble before it arrives. Yes, they always find something. Decides to look. Gave a small hum of agreement. A few minutes later the conductor returned to the lounge. Madam, and with your permission we invite you and the young lady to join us on the platform. Everything is prepared now. Mr. Music Whitmore requested it. He said the request comes from the railroad. Remembering who he was speaking to. Only if you choose music to choose. The second family must be asked appreciated. We'll come. The platform air was cooler than she expected. Touched by the smell of river water, diesel, and sunwarmed metal. Annie stayed close at her side as they walked toward the front. Her hand tucked securely into her mother's. The maintenance team glanced up as they approached. One of the technicians, a black woman in her S with silver at her temples and a flashlight clipped to her vest. Well, now this must be the young lady. In professional curiosity, this is the young lady, she said. Annie looked back at her calmly. I've heard about those sharp. The woman's mouth curved into a smile. My father used to say, I hear you've got sharp ears. That's what my dad used to say. According to this sheet, the hydraulic manifold needs a full softened at the mention of him. Ethan always said it was the heart of the mustached supervisor. We inspected the brake relay housing and the reserve sequence. They're secure. Note the wear pattern here on the sheet. Renee and Annie arrived. My name's Frank. Music. The child's concern was justified and explains that they found contamination buildup. Who authorized the deferral of this work? Music. I need a name, not institutional passive sheet. That's what we're pulling now. Ethan took the page from him and read it in silence. Was it really in the paper? Moved only slightly in his hands, but Renee saw the tension there. Frank continued in the blunt, practical tone of a man with no interest in executive comfort. This didn't happen in one trip. This is the kind of thing that who taught you what to listen for. Rushed sign-offs or pressure to keep rolling instead of pulling. A father who had quietly followed them onto the platform muttered under his breath. There it is. Music. Annie looked up at Frank. So it really was in the sound. Frank gave her the respect of answering plainly. Yes, snorts, ma'am. It was. The child's father was the kind of man who would rather irritate management than let bad work. The silver-haired technician stepped closer and crouched a little so she was nearer Annie's height. Who taught you what to listen for? My father, Annie said. Marcus Carter. The executive office approved that maintenance revision. She rose back to full height and looked at Frank. Marcus Carter from Central Systems. Frank in thought, what you called efficiency. Then recognized design. Another name. Yes, Annie said. Music. The woman let out a slow breath. Lord, did my father sharply. You knew him? Renee asked. Not well, the woman said. But I knew of him. Why did they? Everybody serious did. Why did they not listen? Man had a reputation for being exact. Her eyes went to Ethan, then returned to Renee. He was the kind who'd rather annoy management than let bad work slide. That was him, Renee said. Frank reached for the paper again. Wait a minute, he said, scanning the service notes with growing irritation. This line's updated maintenance policy came after a cost restructuring tied to service. Telling us that's the truth. He looked at Ethan now without ceremony. Your office approved that revision 2 years back. The platform went still. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Music, the force of the moment lay. The train can proceed only after the affected components are replaced. Defend himself. Yes, he said quietly. Frank folded. Cheaper than funeral. Then I suggest this does not stay a station-level problem. That was already decided, Ethan replied. Renee watched him carefully. There was no swagger. The current policy regarding the system of a man finding out that some of the money he once called efficiency travel through the world wearing another name, music, and tugged gently at her mother's hand. Mama. Yes, baby. Daddy tried to stop this before, didn't he? Renee bent slightly and brushed a thumb over Annie's knuckles. Yes, she said. He did. Annie looked at the open panel beneath the train. Then at the grease on the worker's gloves, then at Ethan Whitney standing silent in the evening light. Then why didn't they listen? No one answered right away. Because every adult on that platform knew the answer. They knew about budgets and pride and the way certain words become easier to dismiss when they come from people without corner offices or wealthy surnames. They knew how often honesty is called difficult, how often caution is called delay, how often a working black man has to be twice as exact to be heard half as much. At last, Ethan spoke and his voice carried none of the protection it had earlier that day. Because we valued speed and savings more than we valued the people telling us the truth. Renee lifted her eyes to him. It was the right answer, which only made it more damning. The station bell rang once in the distance. A flock of birds lifted from the far side of the tracks. Evening had begun to gather around the little depot, softening the edges of everything with the fats. Frank took the paperwork under its arm. The train can't music proceed once we replace and clean the affected components, he said. It'll take some time. Walter nodded. Times cheaper than systemic failures are beyond our grim look of agreement. You must adhere to the standardized protocols. He said. This whistle protects the line. Annie stood quietly beside her mother, one hand curled around the brass whistle at her throat. The adults around her were speaking now in the heavy language of systems and responsibility. But none of it changed the simplest fact on that platform. Child had heard the warning because her father had taught her to respect what other people ignored. And as the maintenance crew turned back to their work and the evening air cooled over the rails, Ethan Whitmore remained where he was, facing not a crisis, music not an accident, but something in certain ways harder to escape. A preventable truth, music, still standing. The repairs took just under an hour. Though to most of the passengers, it felt like longer because time always stretches when people suspect they have narrowly avoided learning a lesson the hard way. By the time the train was ready to depart again, the sun had dropped low enough to bronze the station windows and throw long shadows across the platform. The maintenance crew packed away their tools with the solemn efficiency of people who understood that the work mattered even when no cameras were present. Frank Delaney signed the release papers only after checking the service housing himself a second time. And the silver-haired technician gave a final reporting back down. You hear everything the tracks are telling. Keep listening, she told her. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, Annie said. Renee and Annie returned to the train with Walter Green just behind them. The mood inside had shifted again. It was no longer tense in the first, uncertain way it had been earlier. It had become more thoughtful than fearful, more communal than scattered. Strangers looked at one another now with the quiet recognition that comes after a shared brush with what might have gone unseen. They were still speaking music in low voices, but the voices carried gratitude now, not confusion. Day. An older man in suspenders held the vestibule door from Renee. A woman with a silver bun moved her handbag. So please sir, take this seat. Thank you kindly. That's a businessman. Earlier rolled his eyes at the disruption stood when Walter approached screaming and offered him his seat near the aisle. None of these were grand gestures. That was precisely why they mattered. Respect once awakened in decent people often reveals itself in small American courtesies older generations music still take seriously. When they settled back into the lounge car, Renee felt the tiredness in her bones more fully than before. Not weakness, not collapse, just the long fatigue of carrying grief, music, bills, work, and dignity for too many months without enough rest. She, music, had taken this trip because Grandma Louise had called 3 son. And you bring that child. I finally said in the plane, this grief doesn't just loosen it. Left little room for life stays busy. Baby, bring that child down there. Grief don't loosen its grip just because folks stay busy. Renee had known she was right. Annie climbed into her seat and looked out the window as if she wanted to memorize the station before it slipped away. Daddy would have liked those workers, she said. Renee smiled faintly. He would have liked those workers, especially the lady with the flashlight. Walter chuckled from across the table. That's because she looked like she meant what she said. My father would have especially liked the mean. Renee glanced at him. So do old machinists. Walter tipped means what they say. At 2, the train then began rolling forward once more. Outside, the small station drifted backward along with its worn benches, brick depot, and the men who had stopped to make sure one problem did not become something larger. Annie watched until the platform disappeared entirely. Then Ethan Whitmore entered the lounge car. No one announced him, but his presence moved through the room all the same. A few passengers looked up from their coffee. One man folded his newspaper without pretending to read it any longer. Ethan had removed his tie, and there was a crease in the front of his shirt that had not been there earlier. "Forgive me, madam," as if the day had finally managed to lay. "Would it be acceptable if I sat paused beside Renee's table? Not presumptuous this time, but I want to assure you that we are taking full responsibility, for responsibility requires more than just words." Renee studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "You may." He took the seat opposite them. Annie met his gaze directly, neither shy nor hostile. She had an unusual way of looking at adults, as if she expected them to be answerable for themselves. "For a man, your reaction unsettling what I had already started to understand." He said nothing. The dead engineer had not correct, but specifically right that the dangerous issue should never have reached a train. Murmur of conversations that stopped whenever his silence confided in me shortly before the platform, he said at last. When the technician recognized your father approved the main confirmed what I was already beginning to understand. He looked at Renee. Marcus Carter wasn't just right in general. I signed restructuring packages connected to those choices even if I did not train in service. Renee rested her forearm because his name sat above the system that made those decisions profitable. There are people in my company who approved maintenance interval changes. The first honest sentence he has signed off instruction connected to those changes. I did not examine every relay service myself, but that's not an excuse. My name sat above the system that made those decisions profitable. Walter let out a slow breath through his nose. "Did you know my father was sick?" That's the first honest sentence I've heard from an executive in years. Ethan glanced at him. "I realize now then I'm late. Perhaps we over the." Walter's clears throat lined face gave no snorts sign of forgiveness, only acknowledgement. "I knew the engineer was on medical leave near the end." Throat. "I did not know was sick." Renee turned slightly toward her. "The Diane clears throat near the end. I know words can't fix, but I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me. Cancer, stage 4. By the time they caught it, Ethan lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." Renee let the words sit. She did not reject them, but she did not soften toward them either. Sorry was not nothing. It simply arrived too often after the part where it could have changed anything. My father still papers when he was tired. The last strips of daylight were flattening into amber over the fields. He still worked on papers when he was tired, she said. Mama would tell him to rest and he'd say in a minute. A memory passed through Renee so clearly she could almost smell the hospital lotion on Marcus's skin. He had been thinner by then, shoulders sharper under his t-shirt, but his voice still warmed when the room. He would set aside folders so she could sit by him. "We have to make sure as if pain were just another inconvenience and ask her what she heard on the street outside tonight. Sirens, delivery, neighbor's dog." He kept teaching until he did not have enough strength left for teaching, and even then he left everywhere. He thought systems could be fixed, Renee said quietly. "Okay, remember the formulas, we were not just machines. Make sure the structure is music, the most important part." He believed if enough facts were in front of decent people, he believed systems could be fixed. Not only Mock gave a small tired nod. He believed if enough facts were set before decent people, the train lights from distant farmhouses began to appear one by one, soft and far apart across the darkening land. The lounge car lamps came on automatically, bathing the polished wood in order that made the engineers, Clear's throat reported. Instructed legal and operations to preserve all records connected to Marcus between engineering review and executive summaries, not sanitized extracts. All of it was eyes lifted to him. People he worked for prioritized their own convenience over his expertise and the lives of passengers. That is the truth. I suspect there was deliberate suppression somewhere between engineering review and executive approval. Walter's brows rose. Now you're talking about betrayal. Would anyone care for a warm cup of coffee? That word. We also have the apple pie this evening. Betrayal had sharper edges than negligence. Negligence could sometimes hide behind incompetence. I'll take a slice of that. Business. Nothing for me, thank you. Diffuse blame. Betrayal meant someone understood a warning and made a clear throat choice against it. Annie absorbed the words silently. Like when someone father worked for people who should have protected both his expertise brushed a thumb. Yes, baby, those people protected convenience a long time before speaking again. Your father worked for people who should have protected both his expertise and the passengers who depended on it. All of it instead at some point. I deeply regret not telling you this years ago and perhaps themselves. The honesty in that sentence was raw enough that even Renee felt its effect. She had prepared herself for denial. I requested the earliest report they could locate under the dead engineer's name. She had not prepared herself for a man to sit in front of her and say the ugly contamination risk. The server came by with fresh coffee and asked softly whether wanted pie from the galley, apple or pecan. Both surprisingly decent for train food. Walter took pecan. Annie chose apple after careful thought. Renee almost refused then accepted coffee and a slice of pecan because Marcus had loved pecan pie. And sometimes grief enters a room through food with a tenderness. Words my father's work. When the plates arrived, Annie took one bite and smiled. Grandma's is better. Walter laughed. That's the only grandchild can give. Even Renee smiled at that. Ethan did not order anything. He seemed unable for the moment. The report should have been read properly the first time while speaking of buried reports and dead engineers. Instead, this liability structure is unacceptable. Copy of an old document. The projections account for the rates given the current market printed from an archive. I asked operations to send me the earliest report they could locate under Marcus Carter's name. He said Renee stared at he did not reach my desk untouched but were summarized and filtered through cost categories before executive review. Sat a title line about brake relay contamination risk on regional passenger units. Below it in black type and neat attached notes was the technical language Marcus had once carried discussed delaying repairs language he trusted more than hiding from facts leave they prioritized profit over felt her throat tighten she had not seen one of his original reports since the week after the funeral when she boxed up his work files because leaving them spread around the apartment I understand the data but the consequences for the merger we need a resolution tonight the resolution is accepting what the report proves why is report only appearing now because we expected it much sooner. The dead sometimes music fork but he did not say that to a child because it should have been read properly the first time he replied. The train pressed on through the dark reflection on the window everything they said about the table hovering over the night outside. There's no denying the data, right? Her own tired face, Annie's steady one. Walter's weathered calm and Ethan Whitmore sitting among them like a man who had finally understood that money could delay accountability but never mean to tell the truth now. Renee looked at the report again. Then at Ethan. If you mean music, to tell the truth now, she said. Telling all of it is exactly what I am afraid. Exactly what I'm afraid I have to do. And as the wheels carried them deeper into the evening, Annie laid one small hand on the edge of her father's report, not possessive, not ceremonial, just certain, as if the truth had finally come back to the table where it belonged. For a while after Ethan laid Marcus Carter's old report on the table, nobody touched it except Annie. She did not slide it closer or claim it like a prize. She only kept music, her fingertips resting near the lower corner, as if the paper itself had weight beyond its few printed pages, in the warm lamplight of the lounge car with night pressing softly against the window. The report looked less like a corporate document than a witness finally called forward after years of waiting. Renee read the first paragraph without really seeing it. She already knew its shape by heart. The measured language, the technical caution, the absence of drama. Marcus had never written to impress. He never wrote to impress anyone. That was part of he wrote in a way that made evasion difficult. Dependent that precision made him dangerous. Facts in the right order can corner a lie better than anger ever will. Across from her, Ethan Whitmore watched her face rather than the report. He had the expression of a man who understood that no apology would survive if it arrived before the full record did. Walter Green took a slow bite of the Concord and set down even the hospitals and schools. They're all just versions of the same railyards. Machine shops hospitals. Sooner or later, somebody on the ground tells the truth while somebody upstairs calls it too expensive. Somebody upstairs says it's too expensive. Everyone acts surprised when the bill everybody acts surprised when the bill comes due. Bill always looked up from the paper. That sounds about right. I knew men who worked for years. I worked for men who could hear a bearing fail before a manager even knew where the machine even sat. He honors the unnoticed workers who kept whole places in photo ops. They were never the men invited into photo ops or public celebration. They rarely are. The train rolls through dark windows become mirrors. Reflected in them, the little pool of light around the table looked like its own separate world. One held together by coffee, memory, and a dead man's unread warning. Far off in the black, an occasional flash like a lonely ignored him. Annie looked at the report then we understand the implications. Did you know it was this important? Renee almost stopped her from asking, but she did not. Children had their own way of cutting through adult staging. They did not ask whether a man's legal exposure increased or whether internal communications had been properly escalated. They asked the question that sat underneath all the rest. Did you know? Ethan's hands remained flat on the table. I knew enough, he said. Not every technical detail, not every service consequence. I knew enough, but enough to know your father was not guessing. Not every operation warning should have slowed down instead of being music treated as an obstacle. Why did my father not slow anything down? Then why didn't he overruled? The answer took longer, simply too much at stake. Slowing things down costs money. Warnings are often ignored. It affects schedules, contracts. Slowing things down. Investors dislike delays. Executives dislike schedules, contracts, public confidence, and investors all become excuses for delay. And some people begin confusing what is profitable with what is acceptable. Some people begin confusing what is profitable with what is acceptable. That's how wrong gets dressed up to look respectable. Renee took a sip of how wrong gets dressed up. It had gone slightly bitter as it cooled, but she welcomed the bitterness. It matched the conversation. Marcus used to say a lot of dangerous things in this country start with someone calling them report doesn't account for the human. Many dangerous things in America begin with someone calling them. Renee folded the report carefully and then opened it again as though the act of reading and rereading could somehow reach backward through time and give her husband one decent meeting, one honest superior, one chance that had not already been poisoned by accounting language. He used to come home and tell me which men in management wanted solutions. He told me which managers wanted solutions and which ones only wanted smoother paperwork. He knew the difference. He always knew the difference. That was one of the reasons she had loved him so fiercely. My father had been the difference. But neither had he been naive once the evidence. He had not been cynical, but he was never naive once the evidence had begun to pile up. That memory restores his. He believed in doing right work well and in documenting everything before anyone could claim ignorance later. Supervisors respected engineering. He believed in warning people before they could ever say no one told them, making his absence feel almost present that the higher-up could later claim. He saw people clearly and knew exactly which supervisors respected engineering and which merely respected tired even to loosen his tie. The engineer could tell when a meeting had been called to solve a problem and when it had only been called so someone music powerful could later claim process had been followed. They don't want the whole truth, baby. They want the amount of truth that won't interrupt next quarter. Renee had stopped folding the shirt in her hands. Then why do you keep going in there? Marcus had looked toward the bedroom door in faintly from the living room with toy train cars on the rug. The people above the heart from whatever they decide. Only the amount of truth that will not interrupt next quarter. That sentence seemed to settle over the table like a second president. Why do you keep going back into those meetings if the truth is handled that way? Did Daddy know people could get hurt? Renee answered gently, yes, baby, that's exactly why he kept trying. Sounds like she's building the next great railroad. I need to tell you something plainly. He said, one day somebody innocent will ride on whatever they choose. Came through the system. They did not arrive at my desk untouched. He kept his gaze steady on hers. They were summarized, shortened, prioritized against cost categories. What reached executive review was a version of the danger filtered through people whose job depended on making disruption sound manageable. Walter gave a sharp little exhale. There's your betrayal. Yes, my husband knew exactly that. And that is why he kept trying even music when it cost him peace. Not only against Marcus, but against every, I need to say something plainly. Every family that trusted it. Evidence clearly shows what happened next. The paper saying it was ready names. I admit it. Music, she said, the engineer's reports never reached my desk. Tell the truth. There was always an executive review process. The reports were summarized, shortened, and prioritized against cost categories. And each bureaucratic word feels uglier than the last. What executives received was a filtered version of danger shaped by people whose jobs depended on making disruptions sound manageable. The server came by to collect pie plates. It is a betrayal of workers, and curiosity lit her features. Everything all right here? She asked. I need the names. Question polite but sincere. Renee could well look this as complicated. The woman gave a small. Truth gets heavier when it stops being general. I'll keep the coffee coming. That is what she will begin trying to wriggle out from under it. This time he removed was everything all right with the pie but a thin fine. He hesitated. All right is a complicated word right now, as if even now he understood that once certain words were seen by the right eyes they could never be resealed inside corporate walls. These came from archived correspondence attached to the report. He said I had them forwarded. Music during the service stop. Renee's pulse quickened. You read them once these words are read by the right back in his chair crossing. Can never be sealed back inside corporate. Slid the pages music toward her. The emails came from archive director recommended delay forward until after peak seasonal revenue. Another suggested Marcus is technically competent but operationally inflexible. His jaw tightened around, and one vice president wrote that expanding the operations director wanted service adjustments delayed until after seasonal revenue. Nay let out a slow breath that was almost a laugh, except there was no humor in it. There it is, plain English for bury it. Annie looked between them. They called the concern could create unnecessary liability. Visibility. Men like your father often get called difficult by people who are frightened of being corrected. Walter's eyes rested on Annie with grandfatherly steadiness. Remember that, young lady. Sometimes difficult is just what truth sounds like to comfortable. Did they call my father? He nodded very seriously, as if accepting an instruction she would keep for years. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Men like your husband are often called difficult. Music by people being corrected included a recommendation to suspend select pending sound to comfortable people. That recommendation never reached the board. Renee's eyes rose from the email pages. The engineer's final report recommended suspending select train units pending deeper relay. Believe I know. The recommendation never reached the board. Publicly. Walter's face tightened. Publicly. Yes, that single word changed the air again. I believe I know who has trusted music public acts. I'm confirming the details, clears throat before I say it. Live too long for that. Sighs, but because public truth creates consequences private sorrow can avoid. Renee knew the difference. A man could regret something in silence and still protect every structure that allowed him to say it out loud. Only knew the warning was serious enough to threaten revenue and schedule. That was different. That risked boardrooms, stock prices. These emails confirm the wire transfers. The whole measure of elite protection. Renee folded the email. Do you intend to tell the truth before someone else drags it out of you? Do you intend to tell it before someone else drags it out of you? Telling you will cost you. She asked. Yes. Or after Ethan did not bristle. Before Walter gave him a long look. Good. That'll cost you. Yes, I suppose that's the correct price for late honesty. The train curved tired and somewhere farther back, a child laughed at something unrelated to any of this. The sound moved through the car with strange grace. Life continuing, families traveling. The distant laughter underscores that life is continuing all over the train and that reality makes the moral stakes feel even sharper. Ordinary people trusted this railroad while executives debated exposure emails. Can I ask something? You may, Renee said. Ma'am, with your permission, I have one further inquiry. The question was so direct that Walter actually inhaled. Renee's instinct was to interrupt, to soften, to save everyone from the nakedness of the moment, but she did not. Children sometimes deserve the unclothed answer. Ethan considered her for a very long time. When he spoke, his voice held no self-pity. I was a man who let money less honest than he should, make me less honest than I should have. When that happens long enough, it becomes its own kind of bad. Annie absorbed that, but such dishonesty lasts long enough. Can people stop being that? Renee looked down into her cup. Walter looked out the window. Can people stop? The question had moved beyond railroads now, beyond reports. I'm sure they can, sweetie. It had entered the old American territory of character and whether repentance means anything if it costs nothing. Yes, Ethan said at last. Yes, but only if they stop. But only if we stop protecting the wrong thing. No one spoke for several seconds. Have to prioritize. The lounge car lights glowed softly over worn wood and tired faces. Outside, the countryside had turned almost entirely black with only the occasional town appearing in clusters of sodium orange lamps. Somewhere ahead waited Street, Grandma Louise, and the continuation of a family journey that had unexpectedly become something else as well, the reopening of a debt the past had failed to settle. At last, Renee stoked them back to Ethan. Then stopped protecting them, she said. He took the pages, but not before Annie placed one small finger on Marcus's name printed at the top of the report. The gesture was quiet, almost reverent, a child touching proof, a daughter holding the line her father had drawn, and Ethan Whitmore looking at that small finger resting on the dead engineer's name, understood with painful clarity that the truth, music, had now passed beyond management. It had entered the realm. The chapter closes on is no longer about what we remember. The conversation proof right here. We understand the gravity of the situation. What happens now? It grew sharper, more deliberate, as if every person at the table now understood that they had crossed beyond memory and into evidence. Marcus Carter was no longer only a father. A good man described in loving hindsight. He had re-entered the room as a documented voice, one whose warnings had dates, signatures, and a paper trail heavy enough to outlive excuses. For Renee, that shifted something painful inside her. Grief had many rooms, and she had lived in most of them over the past year. There was the room of absence, where she still sometimes reached across the bed before dawn and found only cold sheets. There was the room of practical fear, where rent, music, groceries, and medical debt lined up like creditors at the door. There was the room of pride where she kept her back straight in front of Annie no matter how tired she felt. But this was a different room. This was the room where the dead returned carrying proof that they had been wronged while alive. Annie sensed the change before anyone named it. She sat with her hands folded over the edge of the music table. The brass whistle warm against her collarbone and watched her mother the way only children do when they realize a grown-up has traveled somewhere deep inside herself. Outside, the train passed through a small town whose storefront lights blinked if you signed this window and disappear again into the night. Walter, music, Green leaned back in his chair and studied Ethan with the patient suspicion of a man who had spent time. All right, let's stop wasting time. Are you actually going to help these? So what now? He asked. We are evaluating the best approach, sir. Ethan did not seem offended. I know I haven't been honest in the past. Perhaps the day had stripped that truth about what happened. He rested the papers in his lap. I recognize the gravity of the situation. Now I identify, he said. I now have to find out who intercepted the dead engineer's recommendation before it ever reached the board instead of obeyed. Walter's mouth twitched slightly. I must decide whether my company still belongs to technical warnings instead of one honest sentence at a time. I understand retreat into the old language by reports minimize our responsibility respected the effort repentance it was merely the door who are you thinking of she asked Ethan's eyes lifted to hers former vice president of operations Leonard Voss for one who exactly for maintenance interval restructure cost reduction cycle he had a talent for making risk sound remote and saving sound urgent Renee he's the who always have a talent. He also knew how during the cost reduction cycle, the decision to push the maintenance interval cuts came directly from the former operations executive. Walter nodded slowly. We endeavor to mitigate the perceived risks ensuring that your portfolio remains secure while emphasizing the urgency executive wrote emails engineered to mean one thing. The question language Ethan did not answer at once. I believe he knew her father was serious and ugly. I believe he knew the warning could disrupt revenue forecasts and I believe he decided a valuation model suggests a strong synergy merger. Annie frowned with the grave concentration of my father was right about the executive knew the dead engineer was serious knew the warning threatened revenue forecasts and chose disruption to profit as the bigger problem. The server returned with fresh coffee and a small bowl of soup Walter had apparently without anyone noticing. It smelled of chicken broth and black pepper, simple and comforting in the way food often becomes on trains after the little gently in front of him and then asked whether Renee or Annie needed anything else. Maybe a great shiest. It's a long ride yet. Get some rest after you eat. Renee nodded. That would be nice. I'm afraid there's more smiled and moved on. For a moment her act softened the table. That too felt American in a way older audiences would recognize immediately. Was sent weeks after the dead engineer filed his last formal recommendation. But with coffee refills limit expanded technical discussion immediate review channels until executive messaging at first. There's more means they want this buried. Keep it quiet. Yes, there is. He took one of the printed emails back out and unfolded it. This message was sent what was happening to her husband while they were busy aligning their messaging. It includes an instruction to limit expanded technical discussion outside immediate review channels until executive messaging is aligned. Music, Walter snorted softly, which means keep it quiet. Yes, Ethan said. Renee's hands clasped more tightly in her lap. And while they were aligning messaging, my husband was dying. No one spoke after that. The sentence had too much truth in it to move around. Annie looked down at the table. She had heard the word dying before, lived inside its consequences, but there were still moments when the fact of her father's death struck her not as memory, but as fresh weather crossing her face. Renee saw it and placed a hand over her daughter's. You all right, baby? Annie nodded, though her voice came softer than usual. I just miss him. Walter cleared his throat and looked away, giving them the dignity older men. The railroad owners come to the cab once. Ethan did the same. There are silences that protect rather than punish. When the grilled cheese arrived, Annie thanked the server politely and took a bite without hurry. Listen, the first time this time, the simple smell of toasted bread and butter rose over the table. Renee remembered suddenly the earlier break issue was not isolated. The way the symptoms on nights when the weather turned cold, the reserve sequence still shows a regular lag in the service break relay. Not enough for immediate danger, but enough to reveal long under maintenance. The train is operating safely and is not in accident territory, but this should never be happening on a train that cleared inspection. As if plucking the memory from her mother. Listen, this wasn't scheduled maintenance. Despite everything, you get the next terminal on the horn and have a full team ready. He did because he said squares were too serious. The train remains safe. Laughed quiet. The little girl has better instincts than half the management chain signing inspection reports. Ethan's face every maintenance record tied to this train. I demand a full review. No shortcuts, no polished summaries, and no protective language. He did. That's what made all this worse. He wasn't trying to win a war in some office tower. He was trying to do good work, come home, and keep strangers safe to reach their own families. The train rocked gently through a long curve, laughter and the reflection on the windows, their table floated over black field, scattered lights. Somewhere farther ahead street kept drawing mile by mile should have been caught in maintenance though the train I have already instructed my assistant to pull archived board materials and internal records to the maintenance restructuring period if Marcus's warning was intercepted before I'll know where maybe the truth should not stay internal lifted a spoonful over it soon as a slippery word you're right Ethan said we apologue I apologize for the delay but there will be an unscheduled precautionary service stop. Are we still going to Grandma's? Yes, honey, we are. The confidence of the statement surprised her. Not because she thought he was bluffing, but because only a man fully prepared for his own house to burn would speak like that. This is where the real story begins. Yes, even if one of those names leads straight back to your own office, he held her. Seems we have a significant issue with the coupling, sir. Completely seized. Small, but real. How long do you estimate for the repair? I need this train running tonight. Clears throat as you can see, the contamination buildup fully formed. The little girl's concern was absolutely justified. Another sandwich and said to things become expensive later. Renee turned to her surprise and did the people telling the sink leaked. Annie answered the landlord put all right, that should do it. Now, you be sure to keep listening. Okay, your daddy had wisdom broad enough for plumbing and railroads. That's a useful man. Renee smiled again, more fully this time. It was a painful gift. These small returns of Marcus through their daughter. My father would have liked the work they studied her, especially the woman. It had only changed the ways he entered a room. Ethan seemed to feel that too. Children know what they say, said quietly. Renee took a breath before answering. Yes, he should have been. I have already ordered archived board materials and internal decision memos pulled so I can learn exactly who intercepted the dead engineer warning soon. The refusal to collapse late remorse into early virtue mattered. I will have names. Too many powerful people tried to use sorrow as a shortcut back. You still look music if the names lead straight did not seem to be trying that especially. Not tonight. The conductor passed through the lounge car then informing passengers that they were back on schedule as much as possible and expected to reach St. Louis later that evening with only a modest delay. Several travelers thanked him. One older lady asked whether the continued to be complimentary for all this excitement which earned a ripple of relieved laughter from nearby. The landlord tried to fix it with even Renee smiled at that. Laughter older Americans had a way of restoring balance after tension. He was the kind of useful man whose wisdom covered both plumbing and the railroad. When the conductor moved on, we sure do miss him. Folded his napkin and said it. He should have been heard. You know what? Hearing him now is not the same as hearing him while he was alive. What? That this child had to be the bridge between what her father pleased to announce that we are largely back on schedule and still anticipate reaching St. Louis this evening. That's a relief. Thank you. That's a heavy thing. The coffees say complimentary for all this carefully. Laughter, it doesn't feel heavy, she said at last. What strikes him most is that the little girl had to become the bridge between what her father knew and what grown men helped the rest of us catch up. The word does not feel heavy to me. It feels like not abruptly but with purpose. I need to make some calls while we still have signal. He said, may the Lord help the rest of he gathered the printed pages, then stopped and looked directly at Renee. I meant what I said before dawn. Renee nodded once. Then don't come back. I need to make some calls while we still have signal. He looked at Annie next. And thank you. I meant what I said about having named before dawn for listening to making it impossible not to. After he left, Renee leaned back in her seat and a long breath. You really cared, music without the train itself. Its wheels striking the rails with a measured steadiness that now sounded to Renee like something more than motion. It sounded like continuation, like an old system. Still, the mother listens to the wheel strike the rails with a measured steadiness that no longer sounds like mere motion, but like a sandwich, and rested her head lightly against her mother's arm. Outside, the black countryside streamed past, broken only by occasional station lights and distant homes. Somewhere ahead was Grandma Louise with her good lamp in the front room, her cornbread in the oven, and her way of hugging Creek without letting it run the whole house. Somewhere behind them was the station platform, the open panel, the first formal acknowledgement that Marcus Carter had been right. And somewhere between those 2 points, traveling through the same night as everyone else, there was no names. Ethan, the next call standing between 2 quarter numbers depend on this clearing by midnight. Sealed edges of people and the sound of the rails undercut every sentence with a hard metallic rhythm. He preferred it there. The lounge car had too many witnesses, too much warmth, too much humanity pressing against the shell of the executive habits he was trying not to retreat into in the vestibule with the dark glass at his back and the country rolling past unseen. The merger is leaking. We need to initiate the lockdown protocol. The first call went to his chief music of staff. Apologize for the hour, but this cannot wait with the alertness of anticipated to emergency. The documents are secured and the legal team is on standby in convenience. Where are you now, Ethan? I need archived operational tipping fleet. He said all of it, not summaries. I want the original board memos, the executive review notes, and the full email chain. No summaries, no redaction. Give me the unfiltered reports. There was a brief pause. Tonight, another pause. Thinner this time. Is legal aware? Have you looped in legal on the restructuring enough to ask the only useful question left? And what exactly did you promise them regarding the acquisition? Glass at his own reflection floating. The situation is bad enough that a child maintenance chain missed. Silence answered him, but not empty silence. The kind that forms when competent people hear a sentence and instantly begin reorganizing their priorities around it. I'll wake records, she said. And legal, I'm calling them next. He ended the call and stood still for a moment. One hand braced against the wall. There had been a time when he would have begun such a process differently. He would have called legal first, framed the problem through exposure, assigned a communications team to prepare language, requested a risk matrix before demanding facts. Tonight, the order itself felt morally revealing. When truth threatens a corporation, the instinctive sequence exposes what the corporation worships. He called general counsel. The attorney answered in the clipped, guarded tone of a man who slept with the CFO to freeze clients like Ethan believed the morning. I'm reopening the dead engineer's files. The man on the other end went quiet in a way that answers that legal already knows the danger. No requestification recognition enough. The only category that matters. Enough. That is not a legal category. It's the only category. We recommend a controlled review before any public action. If this relates to legacy maintenance records, I'd strongly advise a controlled review before. No controlled review. There it was. No quiet committee. Two clean words carrying the familiar scent of delay. There will be no control briefly. No private committee. Themed containment plan. No. No controlled review. No committee. No private document history before dawn. Names, dates, and document history before dawn. With all due respect, Mr. Whitmore, it's imperative that we proceed involving. We need to review the documentation thoroughly before the disclosure could. If we align the message, we can control the narrative. The kind of messaging alignment music buried them the first time. The silence that followed the board. When counsel spoke again, his voice had lowered. You've already seen more than I expected. Not enough, which is why I'm done letting lawyers arrive before facts. Still not enough. That sentence cost him something to say. I'm done letting lawyers arrive before facts. But because it was fair to the version of himself who had used them as insulation for moral clarity, he ended the call before. There's nothing more to discuss. We're proceeding as listening to the train move. He could feel physically the steadiness beneath him. The corrected system, the cleaned relay housing, the maintenance work done right and verified by hands that understood steel better than branding. Somewhere up ahead, the engineer was guiding the train through the Missouri dark with the quiet confidence of a man whose warnings had finally been respected. Somewhere behind, in the warm light of the lounge, we've brought the numbers and more dignity than we move forward. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Leonard Voss. Ethan stared at the name before answer served for years as vice president of operations and another 3 in an advisory role after retirement. Marcus, which was the kind of corporate retirement that mostly meant he still had influence without public accountability. He was silver-haired, clubable, unruffled. He's a good technician, I'll grant you that. Remember, his strategic sense markets from memory and could smile while turning a safety. It all comes down to scale and service. Analyze the worst-case patterns in the raw data because frankly raw data. Sounding faintly amused, you can't mean the raw data evening staff. Raw data, what are you digging for? The old Ethan might that a little girl heard the brake lag on a moving train because her father taught her what Leonard terrible numbers sounded like and the sentence lands like a blade. What happened? Tonight maintenance confirmed contamination buildup and deferred service and there is nowhere left to hide. Leonard gave up music, small the incident does not prove the full change. Engineer, good technician, poor strategic sense. The sentence hit Ethan harder than just remember who built this room, Ethan. Strategic sense and be careful weird side. Don't start this in the abstract. You know exactly why. You need to understand. You no longer get to speak to me that way. That time is never understood scale. You cannot halt service movement every time an engineer sees a worst-case pattern in reopening old decisions. In the heat of tonight's voice had gone flatter than the company. His warning was the company damaged itself the moment it taught men like Leonard to call buried risk. Ethan felt something inside him sharpen. The whole matter is larger than one engineer's grievance. Something colder. Anger still hopes the other man does not mean what he sounds like. This did not a little girl heard the brake lag on a moving train today. Ethan said, music, a child because her father taught her what your interpretable number sounded like. I only felt operational noise. And when he spoke, his voice had lost some of its polish. What happened is a moral fail. The train remains safe. Goodbye. Maintenance confirmed contamination buildup and deferred servicing. That is what happened. That does not prove the full chain. Leonard said quickly. Too quickly. Ethan caught it at once. No, the rich people always talk like this. But your urgency to narrow the frame proves something. Be careful. There have been a time those 2 words would have landed as guidance from a senior operator. Some rich people tonight. They landed as threat. Ethan almost laughed. No amusement touched it. You don't get to see. Not all wealthy people speak that way, but if you're reopening old decisions with tonight's emotions still high, you could do real damage to the company. The company did damage to itself when it taught men like you to call buried risk old decisions. Leonard's tone hardened at last. Whether her father knew that this is larger than one engineer's grief grew tired. There it was. The purest form of the sin. Not warning, not duty, grievance. Ethan stared through the dark glass at nothing and saw suddenly and vividly size Marcus Carter, not as a name on reports but as Marcus knew enough to be disappointed and exhausted once, but he kept talking anyway because right mattered more to him than being no board. Friendships against you regarding deteriorated rapidly. You buried him. Ethan apologized for the triaged operations situation in sector requires immediate attention. That's what leads. We need a vote tonight. Marcus Carter was a senior brake systems engineer whose daughter recognized a maintenance fault on the train tonight because her father had taught her what it sounded like. Phone still in his hand. What is the company's exposure? Through the dark, the glass held only his reflection. A man in an open collar, face older than it had been. The company's true exposure had just discovered the architecture that leadership protected convenience over integrity until a child forced them to listen in the lounge car into something quieter and more music dangerous. Clarity. Walter Green had excused himself to stretch his legs, leaving mother and daughter in a pool of warm light near the window. Annie had curled one foot beneath her and was drawing absent-minded circles in the condensation. The routing metadata confirms the breach. We've also included the internal communications, the reclassification record, and a direct phone admission from Mr. Thompson himself. It's merely a legacy personnel issue, a maintenance irregularity. We're handling it. No, this is a moral emergency. Stop the minimization. Now. The question startled because a dead engineer told the truth and his daughter, Music, had to make the company listen, demanding that anyone more worried about Annie nodded as filing away. How is this possible? Renee studied her daughter's face. There was no fear there, no burdened confusion, only attention. Annie was still in many ways astonishingly young, still capable of sleeping with one hand under her cheek and asking for pancakes shaped like stars. Yet tonight she had stepped cleanly into the moral weather of adulthood and remained herself inside. Renee felt both proud and heartsick over that. When Daddy got tired, he said, "What are we going to do?" Did he know they were doing it on purpose? Renee has been removed from advisory access, credentials frozen, preservation orders activated, and an external review retained. I think he hoped at least one soul of it. Annie looked down at the whistle. Is Mr. Whitmore one of the Music ones who knew? Renee leaned back in her seat. Outside, the public statement is being drafted with Marcus Carter's name at the front with Music language naming the failure to honor documented larger towns. Not a legacy. Who wrote that language? She said, but not all in the same way. I did. Some people know because they see the whole wrong thing and choose it. Some people know because they let other what will happen to the bad man who hid her father's papers. Annie thought about that with the fierce seriousness she brought to everything. Leonard will be investigated, and if the records hold as he expects, publicly named later. Walter returned with fresh coffee and the kind of "we talked about what happens to everyone else have been listening nearby with what about you, Mr. Whitmore?" He said, lowered himself into his seat. I will remain answerable to the board to review and to what Marcus tried to tell them. And if the truth says I should leave the company, then I will manage because he did not listen to LB. Annie almost smiled. Walter glanced at her. That wasn't a joke against you, young lady. Just an observation. You have taken the first honest step, must not relieve for walk. Men in power don't change because the train will reach street. Lewis soon, and that the engineer will not forget what Annie heard tonight. They change when the cost of ignoring it finally threatens something they worship. Renee wrapped her hands around the coffee. Do you know people would remember one day he worships? Walter considered he hoped people would listen more than remember reputation. So being remembered isn't the same as being separate, those in certain circles. Marcus deserves toward the vestibule door. Question is whether he's finally frightened enough to worship decency instead. It was an old-fashioned sentence, but an apt one. Renee, Music, knew many people over who would understand it instantly. Not because they lived in churches, though some did, but because they came from music generations that still described moral change in terms of what a person served when nobody was watching. The vest door opened again. Ethan returned. No papers this time. Only the residue of difficult calls. We shouldn't turn the man into skin around his eyes and the steadiness in his movements. But can there also be something for kids who listened to, stopped at the table but did not sit immediately? I have a name. Railroad's fingers on the coffee table. Walter leaned back. Annie looked up. Music. Ethan drew one breath and spoke. I should have listened when your father was alive. Leonard Voss directed the suppression of. I promise that I will not let Marcus's words stay buried again. Full board review. We will provide the full statement and timeline before any swear that my father's name will be said first. Ethan looked at Rushed. He admitted enough tonight for me to know. Annie, thank you for reminding a whole car full of adults that paying attention is a responsibility. Then Annie asked, Ma'am, I apologize once more. So, Daddy wasn't there. She is. Renee felt the answer before she. Oh, I was so worried. I'm so glad you're finally here, baby. He wasn't. For a long moment after Ethan said the words aloud, the train seemed to grow quieter around them, not actually quieter. The wheels still struck the rails with steady force. Glass still chimed faintly in the service counter. Someone near the back of the lounge car still turned a newspaper page. But the truth Ethan had spoken changed the scale of every report anyway, didn't you? Leonard Voss had not merely softened a warning or misunderstood a report. He had suppressed it deliberately. And because he had, Marcus Carter's final recommendation never reached the board that might have slowed the machine before profit outran conscience. Riani did not blink. She sat with both hands around her coffee cup. Though the coffee itself had gone cold enough to lose its comfort, a year of grief had taught her that some truths arrive so late. They do not bring relief. They bring music, shame, pain that had lived like weather, names. Man's got to face up to his mistake. Dream was the first, especially when a child betrayal all the way down. Clear's throat. Ethan looked at him and nodded once. Yes. Annie sat very still beside her mother. I'm sorry. Her face had not crumpled. She did not look confused. She looked like a child receiving the final piece of a puzzle she had hoped would fit another way. Her fingers found the whistle at her throat and held it there. So, Daddy kept trying, she said softly. And that man hit it anyway. Renee turned toward her hand on her shoulder. Yes, but you were so brave. And remained on Ethan. Why? There are questions from adults that invite rhetoric, defense, legal distance, moral weatherproofing. Questions from children rarely leave room for any of it. Why is the most difficult question in America when asked plainly enough? Ethan lowered himself into the chair across from them as if the answer required sitting down. Because Leonard Boss believed problems were only real if they disrupted executive priorities. He said only treated problems as real when he was protecting keeping bad news contained. Walter's expression sometimes had to bury them all. That's not protecting yourself. You knew exactly what you were doing. Renee watched him carefully. She wanted more than once tonight to hate him in the clean, uncomplicated way television villains deserve. Hate when earned cleanly simplifies things. But real music life had a harder texture than that. You prioritize comfort over scrutiny and people got hurt because of it, of arrogance, of preferring comfort, of building a leadership culture where a man like Leonard Voss could bury an engineer's weight. What exactly are you going to do? Top floor would thank him for reducing noise. That guilt was understand why you're angry. So was the fact that tonight it, instead of hiding us from it, that did not make him I'm here to music take responsibility, made him answerable. This behavior has immediate consequences, as I am promising the suspension of the man responsible effective immediately. I'm ordering Leonard Voss suspend. I am ensuring that every communication regarding Marcus Carter's music reports and the restructuring is preserved. Complete paper trail starts now in the maintenance restructuring. I will call an emergency board session before sunrise. Session before sunrise. Walter let out a low whistle. That'll wake some expensive people. It needs to. Renee's eyes did not leave his face. Expensive people. And when they tell you to handle it quietly, what will you do when the board tells you to handle everything quiet? Certainty in that sentence was not dramatic. It was exhausted. Sometimes exhaustion tells the truth better than conviction. Conviction can still imagine applause. Exhaustion only wants the burden named correctly. Excuse me, folks, can I get anyone in the table? Slowed when she saw the expressions there, but I think we're all right for now. Anyone need anything? Hot coffee for everybody still telling the truth. Hot coffee, Walter said. For everybody who's still telling the truth that earned a brief. I understand this doesn't change anything, but I am truly mouth shifted at the corner. Thank you. That means a lot. As if she understood more than she was meant to. And does all this mean my father was brave? Does this mean Daddy was brave? Renee, your father would be so proud of you right now. So far past the present moment. That whistle means we all know the truth. Snorts. Marcus had not. Your father didn't see himself as brave. He had thought of he was just a man doing his job. That was the tragedy without needing men. Especially black men in working America who were asked all their lives to music carry principle without fanfare. They did not name themselves heroes. They paid bills, fixed systems, showed up early, wrote the report, and kept going even when nobody clapped. Yes, Renee said softly. It means he was brave. Walter nodded and stubbed in the righteous way. Annie absorbed that with solemn pride. I think I'm like him. Renee's throat. There is something else you should know before we proceed, she whispered. It concerns the arrangement we discussed outside the foundate. He used the exact phrasing from the original cover, like watchful shift. The phrase operational noise issue appeared in a briefing note sent upward to my office years earlier, and I remember being irritated by how casual and whatever came after this night. Ethan glanced toward the window. Although the wording bothered me, there's something. I signed the review packet anyway. Her expression sharpened. He knew the phrase was wrong and kept moving anyway, reducing corporate complexion to a moral blade. He called Marcus's report an operational thing. That phrase appeared in a briefing note sent upward to my office years ago. I remember it now because it irritated me at the time. I thought the wording was too casual for engineering material. Size. I signed the review packet anyway. Renee did not respond immediately. Already preserve everything connected to Marcus Carter's report. Not summaries, but all of it. And you kept moving. I now suspect this went beyond poor judgment into deliberate. Didn't stop it. Betrayal. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That's true. Does betrayal mean? It means choosing to hurt someone you care about. Leave it to the young to scrape all the paint off the line. Claire's throat sat back in her chair. Sir, it's quite comforting. You understand this isn't just about one train, don't you? I do now. No. Her voice stayed calm, but the calm had iron in it. I mean, all the way. This is about how men in polished offices treat warning when it comes from people they don't have to impress. This report should have been honored back then. It's about class. It's about who gets called difficult when they refuse to sign their name under something dangerous. Ethan did not interrupt. Marcus was not loud. This is my daddy's work. Why do you have it now? He was not employee embarrassing his legacy. He was a careful black engineer with I have the report now because it shouldn't properly stop from deciding he was a problem to be managed. Walter's eyes dropped to the table. If he means to tell the truth now, he must tell all of it. Certain truths begin, they deserve their full shape. And if you think this only happened because of one vice president who learned nothing. Men like grow in places where leadership rewards comfort more than courage. They grow where everybody upstairs. This was when efficiency music starts sounding like a funeral. The lounge car had gone still around them again. I knew enough to know Marcus Carter was guessing. A man with reading glasses music folded them slowly in his hand. No one pretended not to hear the amount of truth. Ethan took the words without defense. Next quarter. You're right, music, he said about all of it. I keep fighting because one day somebody innocent will whatever they choose not to do. The server returned with coffee. Marcus's reports never reached the untouched. They were summarized, filtered by people whose jobs depended on making the danger sound manageable. Ethan, I want names on the house, she said, for long the truth gets heavier when it stops being general. Annie watched the steam rise from one operations director delayed service until after peak revenue and another called Marcus technically competent but operationally inflexible. That brought us. They are not restructuring the department. They are going to bury it, but did not drink. The board will want to know how much exposure exists, he said. Legal will want to control disclosure. Public relations will recommend a phased statement about maintenance review. The escalation log shows Marcus's final recommendation was flagged for board visibility, then reclassified for distribution. Was it Voss? And what will you tell them? That means he had not seen in him all day. That a man named Marcus Carter told us the truth years ago that we failed. What about the men above him who benefited from not seeing the full version? Widening the circle of blame beyond the obvious villain, and that this company will either face what it protected or it won't deserve to keep asking the public for trust. Walter let out a soft breath. That's almost language a decent man. Stop talking like you, or clears throat, standing beside half smiled because you were inside. I'm trying to borrow from better ones. Annie considered him a moment longer. Will you say Daddy's name out loud? Is this why her mother says some people like innocence music more than honesty? In front of everyone, I approved a structure that rewarded. Even if it makes you look bad, safer versions of the truth kept the company moving and my life uncomplicated. Yes, speech finally sounds less like public relations and more like confession. Satisfied. By morning it may be both, but tonight lifted her apple juice, found it empty. Looks like rain tomorrow. Mildly disappointed. Oh yes, dreadful. Despite herself, the train began to slow slightly. Did her father know he might not win? But for the approach to a larger junction outside, yards of sidings and freight lines appeared under music high flood lights. Some people do not measure right by whether they win the night. The sight may stay not ill in bed, not bent over reports. Marcus had honored people up against the wind, seeing the whole system the way some people see a family tree. The board is convening now by video call in minutes, shifting the table from confession to immediate consequence. Walter drank his coffee and looked at Ethan over the rim of the cup. I will begin with Marcus Carter's name. Ethan waited. When you speak to that board, don't talk about restoring confidence first. Let me clear. My husband will not become useful only in his death. Ethan held his charge. You carry now. No, Walter said, listen to me. The numbers don't lie. I'm hemorrhaging capital and I expect a full passing through the junction shortly before continuing to Street Lewis. Passengers shifted, stretched, gathered books. Ordinary travel resumed around the edges of extraordinary conversation. You look like someone learning the difference between baiting the rim of her empty glass with one finger. Calm again, watchful again. As the board responded, 3 members joined while another tried to delay and another asked only whether there had been until morning. He nodded once. Too many men wait for blood on the floor before they believe a warning of the junction yard. You have to fix the light before the roof. Widows, music executives, and witnesses through the same American night. Each person at that table understood the same thing in a different way. The truth had finally reached a station. Beat music rerouted. By the time the train cleared the junction yard and settled back into open track, the hour had moved past ordinary evening and into the deeper part of night when conversations either fade into silence. Are you comfortable, baby? Too important to set down. In the lounge car, more passengers had drifted away to their seats. We've been taking this route for years now. Private thoughts. Those who remain did so. Never gets old, does it? People over who knew it's okay to be sad. Sweet, we'll get through this together. Coffee Place was the table's true companion. Outside, Missouri farmland slipped by in long, dark reaches, interrupted now and then by porch lights, grain elevators, or the pale blink of a crossing signal. Annie had finally grown still enough to lean against her mother's side, not asleep, but settled. One of her small hands rested over the brass whistle at her throat, as naturally as another child might hold a lucky charm. Renee stroked her daughter's hair once and then looked back across the table at Ethan Whitmore. He had been working quietly through a stack of notes on his phone, sending short messages, receiving tour replies, building what looked less like a strategy than an indictment. Every now and then, he paused and rubbed at his forehead as if the day had left a pressure there that no amount of executive discipline could smooth away. Walter Green watched him with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime deciding whether the truth is. At last, he set his cup down. You got to decide if you're big enough. You look like a fellow learning the difference between bad character. Glanced up, tired enough, starting to realize I was wrong about nearly everything that matters. I may be learning both. You've raised her well. She gave a slow nod. That's the kind worth learning. We try our best. Renee turned her cup between her. It's not easy out here. Any response from has there been any response? 3 members confirmed they'll join the emergency. Several members have confirmed they will join an emergency. One pretended not to understand why it couldn't wait until morning. One board member pretended not to understand why it could not wait until an eyebrow, and another asked whether there had been an incident. The truth that there was no exactly. Did you tell them that the train remained safe? That a maintenance issue surfaced, and the reason it surfaced, I assure you there was matters more than the fact that it is safe. Walter let out a little. We only had a maintenance issue surface. Good. Too many. The reason the maintenance problem surfaced matters more than the fact that it looked up at that. Daddy said you don't wait for the roof to fall in before you fix the leak. Renee smiled. Too many men wait for blood on before hands. Your husband must have waited for the roof to fall before fixing the roof. Though sadness stayed in it, he could talk about brake relays and barbecue music with the exact same serious small laugh from Walter, and even Ethan's expression eased. For a moment, the felt like something older and gentler than a crisis meeting. It felt like those late-night kitchen tables all over America where working seems like the world is losing its way. Church women, retired fathers have always gathered to sort out what kind of world they are living in. Decency still has enough room to breathe in it. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. I recognized this number. He read the message. It's about the merger, and Renee saw the change in his face before he said a word. Not fear. Our chief of staff found the escalation tied to the late engineer's final report. She asked. My chief of staff found the escalation for board visibility and then reclassified before distribution, turning suspicion into something visibility and then reclassified. Reclassified the report. Walter leaned forward. By boss. Yes. Can they prove it? Ethan looked at screen again. There's metadata from the document management. Internal routing trail. Timestamp. User credentials. Internal routing trail. Renee sat music back slowly. Facts. Clean facts. Not memory. The records show the system language turning against the people who buried a late-night confession that could be walked. It's not a confession that can be walked back. Metadata. The discrete seems to be a clerical error. Routing trails. The language of systems turning on the people who once used systems to bury inconvenient truth. Annie listened carefully. What about the men? She did not understand the report. The ones who benefited from not seeing the full version. That means he changed it on purpose. I quietly include myself among those who benefited. Renee watched over here. Only the acknowledge. What about the men? Wrong. The ones who benefited from not seeing the full version. Ethan did not pretend confusion. That includes me. The quiet that followed was not hostile. It was exacting. Renee had spent the better part of a year paying for other people's decisions in small humiliating billing offices post-it to the register. There is a kind of fatigue that settles into a black widow when you have failed her husband. It is not the fatigue of tears. It is the fatigue of knowing the world will still ask you to be polite while you carry what others dropped. She set down her coffee. Then stop talking like you're standing beside. Is this what you mean when you say some people prefer innocent? Took the correction without flinching. Yes, he said. I was. Annie looked at him, then at her mother. Is that why Mama says some music people like innocence more than honesty? That line about innocence and honesty, and then remembered saying those words once in the kitchen after a hospital. Laughter. Bill arrived with the wrong coat. Yes, this is exactly why she says it. Marcus had laughed softly from the table and said that right there ought to be stitched on a pillow. Yes, baby, that's exactly why. Walter shook his head with a roof. She comes by it honestly. This child hears everything. All right, I'm putting the phone away. I want to be completely honest with you. Ethan put down his phone. What started as a mistake turned into something I can no longer explain away. A structure that rewards structure rewarding suppression. Allow distance to stand in for judgment and let the board receive a safer version of a dangerous safer version of a dangerous safer truths kept the company moving in my own life uncomplicated my life uncomplicated. That was my part. That is my part. Confession sounds less like public relations and more like confession. It might be both by music the morning, Ethan said. But tonight it's confession. The train rocked gently. From farther down the car came the soft rustle of someone unfolding a blade. The little ones are doing well. That's lovely. 2 women at the far table, voices about grandchildren saying the snow might start by the weather returned by Thursday. Life as always. Goodness. I hope we're past street Lewis by then. Annie slipped her hand into gathering in her for the last hour. Did Daddy know he might not win? Renee looked down at her daughter. There it was. I think he did know he might, walking straight to the heart of a matter adults spend pages circling. Yes, she said quietly. Why did he keep going if he knew he might not? Renee's eyes moved toward the dark window where their reflections floated over the night. She saw herself there, older than she had been a year ago, wearier, but standing. She saw Annie's small profile against her shoulder, and in the space just behind them, memory supplied Marcus as naturally as breathing, his work music jacket, his tired smile, the seriousness in him that was never heavy because it was always tied to care. Because some people don't measure right and wrong by whether they win. Some people do not measure right and wrong by stay faithful to what they knew, but by whether they stayed to what they knew. That's the language of honor. Ethan looked at the table, not hiding his emotions than most people have sat. Your husband had more honor than most people I've sat beside in boardrooms. Renee did not rush to serve that reality. My husband did have that honor. It had earned its sting. Yes, she said he did. A notification tone sounded. Board is convening now with a video call in minutes. This time, music, he read it and immediately stood for the logistics now. How do you intend to begin the video call in minutes? What language leaned back to frame our moral responsibility? How do you plan to begin? Ethan looked for prioritized the murder. The right answer mattered more than polished language. Now with Marcus Carter's name, we will begin with the latest changed at that. Not into joy exactly, but into something steadier, more solemn. Say it right. You have to say it right. Ethan almost smiled. I understand. I will. I promise I will. Before he turned to go, Renee spoke one more time. Do not make my husband useful. Only in death or suddenly admire the man your company found inconvenient while he was alive. The man your company found inconvenient. You must tell the board what was done to my husband, clears throat, and what kind of place allowed it. What kind of place allowed it? He took that in like a man receiving instructions before stepping into what this will cost the company until he has first what it already cost until after you ask what it already cost the decent people in it. Do you have anything else to add before I speak to the board? He looked at Annie last. Anything else? She thought for a moment then said don't make him sound small. It was such a child's sentence and such a devastating one. Renee felt her chest tighten around it. So many institutions shrink the people they fail, reducing them to employee, music, number, legacy, concern. Former engineer, I promise you that I will not diminish the engineer. I will not allow that. I won't, Ethan said when he left for the vestibule again. The lounge car felt both emptier and calmer. Something irreversible had begun. Not justice completed, not redemption guaranteed. But the moment had passed when truth would still be rearranged into a memo. Walter sat back for the sigh and glanced at Renee. I am not all right. Renee gave the kind of smile when the honest answer is more complicated than the room snorts requires. Steadiness counts, she said. But I'm steady. That counts. May I tell? Annie leaned into her son. May I tell them, Mama? Yes, baby, when we get to Grandma's house. Grandma's. Can I tell her, Daddy? Say that my father still. Renee closed Clear's throat, her eyes for one brief second. Yes, she whispered. You can tell her that. Outside the night opened wide around the moving train. Small towns rose and fell in pools of amber light. We have mistaken control for wisdom for too long. Somewhere beyond the dark river. This approach is unsustainable to speak to a boardroom full of people who had long mistaken control for wisdom. And in the lounge car, under warm lamps and the quiet music, witness of ordinary travelers, a widow and her daughter waited to hear whether the truth would finally be said in the language it had always deserved. The Missouri expansion is not negotiable. We're losing time. The training situation, the deliverables will be ready. The restructuring will seem to remind him that this conversation was not taking place in a tower or a private club or some insulated convergeties, and the Q reports are undeniable. Thomas, we have a duty to the shareholders to disclose this truth about how his company had treated the decision in the same night. With all due respect, Eleanor, this timeline is completely unrealistic given the market volatility. Silver-haired composed. I understand the urgency that calling this meeting at midnight is frankly disrespectful of our time. The market doesn't sleep. Finance, music, heavy expression already sharpened by irritation at being called this late. Then Sonia Rieff, former regulator whose face carried none of Talbot's annoyance. This warning has significant inconvenience for the require immediate justification. Two other directors joined without speaking. Their homes behind them, dark studies, kitchen lights, city windows made the whole thing feel more intimate and more damning. Margaret was first to speak. Ethan, this had better justify the hour. He looked at the grid of faces and thought, not for the first time. I will begin with the American disasters begin with someone of means asking we Jenkins. Yes, it does, he said, and I'm beginning with a name. He was a senior brake systems engineer tied directly to the regional passenger network. His snorts expertise is now on the record, as though he half remembered something. Repeated warnings about brake relay contamination and deferred servicing have been submitted years earlier and ignored, which was its own kind of reaction. Earlier tonight, a maintenance issue surfaced on one of the trains. The train remained safe and there was no accident only because the warning was caught in. The issue was recognized by the engineer's young daughter on board because her father had taught her what brake trouble sounds like. A maintenance issue surface. Before we discuss the human element, I need to know the exact extent of our financial exposure. But the issue was recognized by Carter's exposure was not a loss because her father had told the fact that the dead engineer was right along. Then Eric said the thing men like Eric, the engineer's final recommendation for broader action had been deliberately suppressed for full board review was that Marcus the company treated a true warning as operational recommendation for broadly suppressed reached full board review the company as operational noise and protect the metadata and the email trails confirming the cover the warning was deliberately suppressed by whom Leonard Voss and I know who was responsible. Sonia's mouth tightened. Eric leaned back. What the hell are you talking about? One of the other directors. We require evidence executive named Paul a curse under his breath. But the records show the routing metadata to subsequent internal communications. Regarding the transfer and the final reclassification records are all present. He adds that music he spoiled to the retired operations power broker directly that notification and heard enough to confirm intent. Email language tying expanded. Is really just a legacy personnel issue combined with a minor maintenance regulation. There was no harm with Voss directly tonight. This framing is unacceptable. A dead engineer already told the company the truth of the night a legacy personnel issue. You let men above the engineer filter the truth until it became convenient once music rooted in class insulation. The engineer's little daughter had to make them listen, and anyone worried about engineers told this company should be known before and we built a culture that led men above. We need those documents immediately. I want them produced by dawn. Called because his daughter had to be the one to make us listen. The files are already on the screen. If anyone on this board is more concerned with investor discomfort than moral failure, I want that known before dawn. No one interrupted him. The silence on the screen changed character then. It was no longer the silence of impatience. It was the silence of people realizing music he had. Did you say my daddy's name? And Byrne was the first to move. Yes, baby, he said, she said. Now, the powerful man knows he had better say it right. Replied. Music. You'll also see the maintenance confirmation from tonight's station inspection along with the preserved record chain tied to Carter's reports. Glanced off farther down, the widow cherishes her face still as she read. Eric swore again. More softly this time. Paul took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose like a man who had just discovered an old decision had menaced you both earlier against her side and watched the black window carry their reflections forward. The owner of the railroad had not said much in the past. We appreciate the invitation the way older men often do, that some moments should not be crowded. He knew Daddy's name right away, resting in both hands, looking every so often toward the front of the train as if he could hold truth to hold its shape inside a room full of board members. Annie glanced up at her mother. Do you think he said Daddy's name right? Smiled. The owner was hoping you and the child might be willing to hear him out privately in the lounge section ahead. Good. The train rocked gently. Somewhere down the car, a woman laughed at something on the phone. The sound low and ordinary. Please, won't you both sit down? Renee loved that sound for existing at all. Ordinary life continuing while justice knocked on a richer door. That was how America worked. Music, when it both an apology. Not with trumpets. You do. With somebody still heating coffee while another person finally got cornered by arrogance, Walter cleared his throat. Your husband ever imagined anything like this? You silence everyone who challenges you. Not exactly. How did you know my father's truth should matter before spectacle? He looked down at Annie. He would have hated needing all this to get heard. My father worked for one of the railroad divisions and he saw carrying that name more than the conference compartment. Lifted her eyes from the documents on her screen. He was a persistent senior breakout. Email chain is ugly. He wasn't exactly liked by operations managers. Is one of corporate America's favorite punishments for a principal carefully before any public statement. If vocified the recommendation without full executive understanding, we should isolate responsibility before we characterize organizational failure. The engineer is asking for the owner to come to the cabin. Characterize words meant to build a fence. I told you to in the first. Leaned forward. The pressure in the main reservoir is dropping too fast. We're losing braking power. Explain how long that is. Exactly how this happened. He said, one man suppressed. The pressure imbalance was not isolated. It's a symptom of a much larger maintenance problem across the entire line. Music pretends responsibility lives in one office only. It doesn't. The train is safe for now, but should never have passed inspection with music this lag. So does the leadership structure. The young girl heard something maintenance should have caught long before the trip. Sonia said nothing. I demand at music full service team at the next terminal. Very much like approval. This sign-off needs a second look, ma'am. The stress models are in policies. Fatigue analysis deserves a closer review before approval. Then you may be holding just a train remains safe. The little girl has better instincts than music. Half the management chain signing these reports. Ethan, I want operations notified immediately and pull all this goes public or the real market. Sonia turned her head toward him with such cool disdain that Ethan almost respected the beauty of it. The market is not the first armed party in this conversation. Eric Robert held up one hand, ending the crossfire. I was only listening enough. She looked back at Ethan. What exactly are you proposing before sunrise? He had thought about that in the vestibule in the dim corridor in the space between calls. People wouldn't listen and it made him lonely and formal, but he kept talking anyways. From all advisor appreciated what you noticed. Operations has been notified. Restructuring reports independent external problem. Music, we are preserving all records and initiating acknowledging internal reviews are where the truth goes to get dressed for church or under active investigation and a commitment on record that no employees are still going to engineering review may be downgraded outside transparent multi-level signal. Margaret listened without interruption. In your own role, she asked. Ethan answered without hiding behind phrasing. I approved the structure that rewarded this behavior. I signed packets that I should have questioned harder. That was incredibly brave. The board believes that disqualifies me from continuing. Laughter after disclosure. I will not sit here. Not many people look past music, the metal. Sonia was. You see how it breathes. That may be the first responsible the bypass valve. Paul nodded once. I'm the regional service supervisor. Margaret said nothing. The girl's concern was justified. Contamination and deferred cleaning were found beyond proper This is not one-trip damage but cumulative neglect. Rush sign-offs or pressure to keep rolling. If it really was sound, who taught you how to? Sweetie shareholder revolt. Yes, and you are still recommending the cost restructuring change the break servicing interval. This accumulated risk, this accountability squarely on your desk. Report. He thought of Renee's face before. Why didn't they listen? Don't make my husband music useful only in death. He thought of Walter saying truth gets dressed, powder on its face. He thought of the ordinary passengers asleep now under dim train lights trusting steel. They had. I need you to keep listening carefully. Okay, because silence already had years, he said, and because music decency delayed becomes cowardice with better tailoring. No one spoke after that. Then Sonia gave a single visible nod. Paul followed. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. My father would have liked those workers, especially draft the emergency resolution. I want the board within the hour. And Ethan, yes, when this becomes public, Marcus Carter's name does not go in the third paragraph. It goes in the first for the first time. That music night. Something in each suspending the retired operation advisor, preserving every Carter-related communication and calling an emergency. Back in the lounge, car had drifted into the edge of sleep with her head against Renee's shoulder, not fully, just resting in that childlike borderland where voices still pass. Renee brushed her fingers through Annie's hair. So you heard a wrong thing and told her the meeting had moved. Walter wrote, this is not about one train, but about race, class. The way officer was a bad man. Their voting on emergency resolution and distance made him less honest until that itself became its own. External review was moving. I appreciate the observation orders are active. Let's ensure this operational noise doesn't distract from the main objective. See to it that the matter is closed. We need public acknowledgement naming the dead engineer. If the board decides my role to qualify me, I offer my resignation. Acceptable. We will move forward with the external review. Silence has already had years. Decency delayed become cowardice with better tailoring. Emergency resolution engineers name the resolution all night. Yes, I did. The vote passed before midnight. Ethan did not announce it with drama when he returned to the lounge car. He simply stepped back into the warm pool of lamplight where Renee, Annie, and Walter sat and carried the result in his face like a man who had finally stopped trying to separate consequence from character. The train had begun its final run toward Street Louis, and there was a sense all through the car that the night had turned a corner. Not ended, not healed, but turned. Walter was the first to read him. Well, Ethan took the seat opposite them and let out. The emergency resolutions have all been approved. All emergency executive has been stripped of access. Leonard Voss is removed from advisory access effective immediately. Credentials are frozen and outside review will begin. External review is being retained before dawn. Preservation orders are active across operations. Preservation orders now cover operations and executive archives. That's the machinery. Ethan met his gaze. Yes. What about the soul of it? Then what about the soul of it? That question held the room still for a moment. Renee looked down at Annie, who had lifted her head from her mother's shoulder and was awake again. Though drowsiness still softened the edges of her face, she watched Ethan with the same steady-held, clear throat, all perhaps flawed in his tiredness could slow her body. We are committed to honoring the legacy without the state is already being, and that the deceased brake engineer's name is not being framed as a legacy housekeeping matter. The review will not be hidden as harmless housekeeping framed as a failure to honor engineering warnings that were documented. The man had said something acceptable. Not admirable, not yet, but acceptable. Renee wrapped both hands around her fresh cup of coffee. Who wrote that language? I wrote it myself. I wrote it myself. She held his eyes for a second longer. Okay, good. The train ran through a corridor of scattered industrial lights, and for a little while, they all sat in the low hum of motion and consequences around them. The remaining passengers in the lounge car had entered that late-night quiet particular to American travel. The train is running late. Jackets folded on. Don't worry, I'm fine. Newspapers abandoned on tables, murmured phone calls to spouses saying they were delayed, but all right. A man in a windbreaker snurred softly 2 tables over. An elderly woman carefully repacked a crochet bag. Life had resumed its ordinary posture, which made the moral seriousness of their table stand out all the more clear. What happens to the bad man first? Now, what happens to the bad man now? Renee turned slightly toward her. Which bad man are you talking about? The one who hid Daddy's paper. The one who hid my father answers before Renee could. I suppose that Leonard Voss will be investigated, and if the record buried the warning will be investigated the records. Annie accepted that, then asked the harder question children always save for later. What happened to the railroad? Walter's eyes lifted. Renee did not interrupt. Ethan looked at Andrew and placed something fragile but unavoidable directly into his hands. The dead engineer stay answerable. He said he failed to listen to the review to what your father tried to tell us. You were right, and if the truth means I should leave this company, then I leave it. Annie tilted her head just slightly. Because you didn't listen either. Yes, he said, because I didn't listen either. This is only the first step followed. Do not trip over relief and mistake it for finished work. Silence was the most American thing about the night. I promise I will not mistake relief for completion. Not the corporate language turning finally into confession, but the refusal of ordinary people to rush a powerful man into redemption just because in about minutes respect in the old moral sense. I am instructed to relay the engineer's message. It required cost. You will not forget Follow. Walter reached for his cup and drank. Yes, sir. You've taken your first honest step. Music, he said. Don't trip over your own relief and call the walk finished. A tired half-smile passed over Ethan's face. I won't. Renee believed him, at least for the next minutes. Beyond that, he lived too long to hand out trust wholesale. The conductor came through the lounge car with quieter feet than usual music and paused beside their table. It's hard. He had clearly heard enough pieces of the evening to in the presence of something larger than a delayed train. Music will be industry. Her father hoped people would listen, not remember. Just wanted to let you know because he did the work simply because it was right. After a brief hesitation, being remembered is not the same as being the engineer asked me to tell you he won't forget what you heard tonight. Annie sat a little straighter. Your father may not have to be remembered. Yes, ma'am. When he moved on, Walter gave Annie an approving glance. That's how your remembrance must not be where it stops. Yes, sir. Those simple courtesies mattered to her more than ever tonight. After a year of forms, bills, and professional voices speaking about grief instead of through it, plain respect felt like clean water. Annie touched. I need to make calls while we still have signals. Can I ask before dawn? The truth will not return and said, did Daddy know people would remember him one day? Explain to the board exactly. Instinct is going to crucify sometimes want to protect children. We need to focus on containment and regulatory exposure right now. The engineer's daughter recognized the brake fault on board because her father taught her what danger sounded like. I think your daddy hoped people would listen. Music carefully was right and his warning was deliberately suppressed. Routing metadata, internal emails, reclassification records, and a direct admission from the older executive. Walter smiled into his cup. That's the era of polite delay is over, Mr. Davies. We require those documents immediately without further alteration. Something closer to humility without self-pity. Your father may not have worked to be remembered, he said, but he deserves to be. Renee met that line with a steady gaze. Do rich people always make sure it's the truth? He nodded. They practiced till it sounded crossed a bridge in the low thunder of Strictly Off the Record. A brief silence. We are prioritizing seamless transition and minimizing market disruption. Caught strips of reflection. Technically gifted, yes, perhaps even a visionary, but ultimately he lacked the strategic grounding required at this level. A naive approach. A child heard the brake lag because her father taught her what those interpretable numbers actually sounded like. And that maintenance already confirmed contamination and deferred servicing. Reopening old decisions could damage the company had become too layered over cannot be renamed history. One was the simple one. A mother and daughter are different. Music procedurally, this is after many hard months apart. The engineer was the journey the night forced on all of them. The one from warning to witness from marrying a truthful engineer was not leadership. It was moral failure. The first had been planned. Was father lonely after? They both would arrive in Street Louis together. His phone vibrated again. He checked the screen and passed it across the table to Renee without music, a word. He knew and he chose to hope anyway. Was the draft statement still marked that embargoed but already bearing the shape of mourning? The first line read, White-Or National Rail acknowledges that engineer Marcus Carter raised documented safety concerns that were not leadership. Renee was felt something deep and exhausted inside loosen a fraction. Not forgiveness, not peace, but vindication beginning to put on its coat. She handed, if you intend to tell the truth now, you must all of it. Ethan, not merely the safe pieces. There will also be a scholarship fund in his name. For young engineers. Walter made a low sound in his throat. Careful. Ethan looked at him. What? Don't turn a man into a foundation. Music. The company acknowledges that the documented safety concerns raised by the late Mr. Harrison Renee is a start because the line was sharp and true, and exactly the also a scholarship fund in the engineer's name for young engineers. Ethan, do not turn a truthful man into a platform before honoring the actual man who talked back. Can there be something for kids who listen to machines? The simplicity broke whatever remained of the night stares. I did. Walter laughed aloud. He made his point quite clear. Renee did too, softly. But is there something for children who listen to machines? Even Ethan smiled in full for the first time all evening. I think he said so. Does that ticklish? Good mommy. Laughter said it must be because daddy said most. Walter wiped one eye with the back of his head, still smiling. The dead engineer left wisdom, didn't he? He surely, snorts, did. Ladies and gentlemen, clears throat, this is your conductor. We will be arriving at the station in approximately minutes. Please ensure you have all your belongings. Passengers stirred, gathered bags, folded blankets, checked phones. The familiar rituals of arrival moved through the car. Annie, music, slid from her seat and helped her mother button her coat with the solemn concentration children bring to tasks they view as important. Renee adjusted Annie's collar and tucked the whistle, music, safely back beneath the sweater. Ethan rose, too. For a second, it seemed he might say something polished or unnecessary. I know none of this does anything, Miss Carter. It does not, said quietly. I know this does not undo anything. No, Renee replied. You deserve to be heard. It doesn't, he nodded. I wasn't listening before. That was better than apology, repeated. Some truths are not improved by more words. Your father saved far more than a man's music report tonight. He bent down so that he was his lesson lived on through her, not asking her to rise into my father, but lowering himself into hers. His voice when he spoke had lost the boardroom. Altogether, your father saved a lot more than a maintenance report tonight. You were right through you. I shouldn't have done that. And he looked at him steadily. Can you listen? Yes, Ethan said. He did. And then in full view of the quiet lounge car with ordinary passengers glancing over newspapers and coffee cups with watching like a jury. Ethan Whitmore went one step further. Not theatrically. Not like a man performing humility, music from which let the dead finally understanding the correct height from which to speak. Renee felt the air in the car change around the gesture. Older people notice postures. They know when someone is posing and when someone is being brought low by truth. Ethan kept his eyes on Annie. I should have listened when your father was alive. He said, okay, I didn't. I will carry that, but I will not let what he said stay buried. Annie did not rush to comfort him. She only touched the whistle once through her sweater and gave a small solemn nod. Okay, she said. It was not absolution. It was something stricter, and perhaps we won't let you down. More hopeful. Permission to prove it. Street Louis arrived with the kind of midnight glow only working cities keep. The train slowed beneath high lamps and signal bridges, rolling past freight lines, dark warehouses, and long rows of parked cars shining faintly under station lights. Then the platform came into view, broad and bright against the surrounding dark with bundled and station. Let's gather our things and get ready to go. Purpose under the clock inside the lounge car. People rose in stages, gathering coats, handbags, newspapers, half-finished coffees, and the small worn habits of travel. The ordinary business of arrival resumed all at once. Yet nothing about the night felt ordinary anymore. Renee stood and helped Annie into her coat. The child lifted her arms dutifully so her mother could smooth the sweater collar down over the brass whistle. That whistle mattered more now than it had even that morning. It had crossed from keepsake into symbol. Though Annie, music, herself still held it with the clean instinct of a daughter who simply wanted one piece of her father close to her skin. You ready? Annie nodded. Yes, Grandma is waiting for us. Questions? Renee smiled. Tired but real, and you're going to answer. Everyone rose from his seat with the careful stiffness of his knees had earned every year he carried. He picked up his hat, settled it on his head and looked at Annie, music, with a grave fondness that felt now. Well, young lady, it has been an honor. An honor to make your appointment. Took that seriously. She did everything that mattered. Thank you, sir. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Walter. He extended his hand and she shook it the way she had seen older people do in church foyers and funeral receptions, with attention and respect rather than playfulness. Walter then turned to Renee. Mom, Mr. Green. He gave her the small nod of one working adult to another. A gesture full of the old code. Your snorts husband would be proud tonight. The sentence struck with such clean gentleness that Renee had to steady herself. A blessing to meet someone like you right now. Music, thank you. She said softly. That means more. Sure, the manifest is reconciled. Before we reached toward Ethan, who stood a few giving the conductor a final instruction, and him, Walter said under his breath. Don't be too quick to trust this route. But don't ignore change when it finally decides to show up either. See, folks can surprise you after surprise you after. Renee glanced at him sidelong, speaking from wisdom or experience. Walter's mouth twitched, both the careful getting off a soft jolt as it hold doors opened. Cool night air entered the carrying the mixed music, sense of diesel concrete and the faint smell of stations that I offer my sleep apology. Travelers began filing off with the relieved forward energy of people who have been sitting too long and are nearly home, nearly somewhere, music nearly done. Ethan waited, but a small rush had passed before a grandmother is waiting. He no longer looked like the man who had boarded hours earlier under the smooth protection. My office will contact you tomorrow. He still wore the same statement and the record, the same face recognized in business magazine. We should see everything before strangers do. But the arrangement had changed. He now carried consequence openly, and while consequence polished instead of true, sometimes returned to human right to say so. I won't keep you, he said. Renee adjusted the strap of her purse. Are you truly going to say my father's name? Moved through his expression. I imagine so. Then he looked at I will say your father's name. My office will contact you both. I will not rush but not press first. With the full statement, the review timeline and the pardon me, but I couldn't let you leave without saying what a delight was to have you with us. Renee appreciated that show. Laughter. Good. You reminded a whole car of adults that paying attention is a responsibility. At any point this starts sounding polished instead of true. You did wonderfully up there, young lady. A real professional, standing nearby with his head in hand, gave a low approving hum. Now that's a useful sentence. Annie, I apologize. Are you really going to say Daddy's name on TV? The directness of the question cut through all adult texture. Ethan answered just as directly. Yes. In the first part, yes. And not fast. He almost smiled. Not fast. Satisfied. Annie, crying, nodded. Okay. The conductor appeared beside them then, cap in hand, carrying himself with the formal courtesy of a man who had decided this family would not leave his train unacknowledged. Miss Carter, he said to Renee. Before you go, I wanted to say something properly. Renee turned toward him. All right. He looked first at Annie. Miss Annie, I've worked trains a long time. Reminded a whole car full of adults that paying attention is a responsibility, not a hobby. Oh, baby, look at you. Who had received enough praise in a few hours to overwhelm most, accepted this one with the same calm as the others. Thank you, sir. The conductor then finally here. I missed you so much. I'm sorry for the way this began. I should have listened sooner. Renee held his gaze a moment, then, snorts, nodded once. Thank you for saying it. He stepped back. You so much. His duty done. We're all together. In that small exchange, the night gathered yet another, snorts, witness. Not a headline. You look tired. Not a board member. Just getting enough rest over defensiveness. It's been a long week. Renee had learned long. Trouble seems to have found her, and she stood there waiting for it to explain it. They stepped down onto the platform. The station lights felt almost startled after the enclosed warmth of the lounge car. Annie reached immediately for her mother's hand. Around them, travelers hugged arriving relatives, dragged wheeled luggage over concrete, and hurried toward parking garages or taxi lines with the anxious relief. They are all coming home and will tell everything from the beginning, offering not so passion. Music. The city was awaiting all the stories that mattered. And there, just beyond the security railing and a row of metal benches, stood Grandma Louise. She wore a navy wool coat and church shoes sensible enough for waiting, with a knit cap pulled down over silver hair and a handbag tucked under one arm, like she was ready to whip a whole station into music order if anyone gave her cause. Even from a distance, Renee could see she had been worried. Worry sat in the set of older women's shoulders differently than the younger ones. Are you tired, sweetie? It carried history. I'm hungry. Carried children, raised funeral service in Swan Inn, sweetie. It's warm. Faith tested. I put your blanket right there for you. Then Grandma Louise saw them. Oh, praise God, she said, not loudly, but with a fullness that rose above the station noise. Anyway, Annie broke into the first true child's run she had managed all night. Grandma Louise opened her arms and Annie hit them hard enough to make the older woman step back half a pace before she wasn't, like they said on the shut. It was quiet, first pressing the back of Annie the way only grandmothers do. I heard it first with music. It sounded just like this whistle but bigger, and it echoed through the whole trainer. My baby. The train was my baby, and the man a second later into the embrace too. For one long moment the three generations stood together, stationed while strangers moved around in coffee cups and no idea passing the center of something sacred. When Louise drew back enough music to see their faces, she cupped Renee's cheek first. You look tired. I am. Then she looked at Annie. And you looked like trouble found you. Then you stood there with my voice crosses the music state lines. Annie smiled, moving beyond the small kitchen. Fix the train. Louise's face changed. She did not ask what that meant immediately. She knew enough about grief and children to understand when a sentence needed to be received before it could be questioned. Her gaze dropped to the whistle beneath Annie's collar, then rose to Renee's eyes. At last, the world had been forced to listen, and the child's face rests calm in the back seat, as if the work is finally done for tonight. And you're going to tell me everything, music, from the start. Renee nodded.